In the opening years of the 6th century, probably sometime between 507 and 509, Theoderic the Great was consolidating a political order that was unusual even by the standards of post-Roman Europe. The Gothic king had ruled Italy since 493, yet his ambitions extended beyond simply maintaining military control over the peninsula. At some point during these years, he appointed a man named Colossius as both military commander and civil governor of Pannonia Sirmiensis. Colossius, generally thought to have been a Goth despite his Roman name, received instructions that reveal something important about how Theodoric wanted Gothic power to be understood. He was expected to protect the province by force when necessary, but he was equally responsible for governing it according to established law. Theodoric presented this appointment as more than the installation of another provincial official. He reminded Colossius that Pannonia had once belonged to the sphere of authority exercised by his royal relatives and suggested that its inhabitants would welcome the return of those who had previously defended them. Yet the most revealing part of the message concerned the character expected of Gothic government. Colossius was instructed to protect the innocent courageously and, through his conduct, demonstrate Gothic justice in a world where other peoples were supposedly corrupted by destructive customs. The Goths, according to the political ideal expressed in the letter, occupied an exceptional position. They possessed the practical intelligence traditionally associated with Rome, while retaining the martial strength commonly attributed to the non-Roman peoples. This was a powerful ideological claim. Instead of allowing the Goths to be placed automatically among the barbarians surrounding the remnants of the Roman world, Theodoric's political language created a different category for them. Other nations could be portrayed as violent, disorderly, or governed by undesirable customs, while the Goths were presented as disciplined defenders of justice. The distinction raises an important question about the political imagination of Theodoric's kingdom. Was he deliberately attempting to move the Goths across the traditional boundary, separating barbarism from civilization? More importantly, was Gothic identity being reconstructed so that the Goths could claim a place within Roman civilization without simply becoming Romans themselves? This problem becomes especially interesting when the Ostrogoths are compared with another Germanic people who later established themselves in Italy, the Langobards, better known in English as the Lombards. The Ostrogoths controlled the Italian kingdom from 493, whereas the Langobards entered the peninsula in 568 under King Alboin and created their own political order on former Roman territory. Both peoples developed narratives explaining who they were, but those narratives emerged under very different circumstances. Rather than treating these identities as permanent ethnic characteristics inherited unchanged from ancient ancestors, it is more useful to understand them as political constructions shaped by particular historical situations. Theodoric's Italian kingdom depended upon a carefully maintained relationship between Goths and Romans. He did not attempt simply to erase the distinction between the two communities. Instead, his system gave each population a recognizable function. The Gothic population supplied much of the kingdom's military strength and was expected to defend the realm, while the Roman population continued to participate heavily in civilian administration and taxation. Roman taxpayers, in effect, helped sustain the Gothic military establishment that protected the kingdom. Modern scholarship has therefore described Theodoric's system as a form of integration achieved through separation. Goths and Romans belonged to the same political structure, yet they were not expected to become indistinguishable from one another. Alongside this practical division of responsibilities came an ideological effort to define what being Gothic actually meant. Gothic identity could not remain merely the identity of foreign warriors occupying Roman land. For Theodoric's political system to function effectively, Gothic military supremacy had to be given a legitimate place inside a civilization that still regarded Roman institutions, laws, traditions, and cultural standards as immensely prestigious. The result was an image of the Goths that emphasized both their martial inheritance and their ability to participate in Roman political civilization. They were warriors, but they were not supposed to appear savage. They ruled through force when necessary, yet their authority was expected to operate within a legal and moral framework. The Langobards would eventually construct a rather different vision of themselves, Around 668, or perhaps slightly later in 671, during the reign of Grimoald I, or possibly that of his successor Perctarit, a short but highly influential account of Langobard origins was composed. It later became known as the Origo Gentis Langobardorum. The narrative reaches far back into a legendary northern past when the people later known as the Langobards supposedly bore the name Winnerly. According to the story, the Winnerly confronted and defeated the Vandals on a distant northern island called Scadanan. Whatever historical memories may lie behind this tradition, its political significance was much greater than its value as a literal record of migration. The origin story provided the Langobards with a usable past. It explained their beginnings, celebrated their ability to survive conflict, and defined them through opposition to hostile outsiders. This identity was especially meaningful because it was formulated during a period when the Langobard kingdom faced powerful enemies. The story could therefore transform legendary ancestry into contemporary political language. In contrast with Theodoric's attempt to present Gothic identity as compatible with the civilized Roman order, the Langobard narrative could emphasize precisely what was non-Roman about the people. Its ideological force could be directed against both Roman and Frankish opponents. The contrast reveals how flexible early medieval identities could be. Neither Gothic nor Langobard identity should be imagined simply as an ancient cultural package carried intact across centuries. Political circumstances determined which qualities were emphasized and how collective memory was organized. After 507, Theodoric increasingly represented himself as a ruler, operating within the traditions of Roman government. At the same time, Gothic soldiers were portrayed as protectors not only of Italy, but also of territories connected to Theodoric's expanding sphere of power, including regions in Gaul and Pannonia Sirmiensis. In this context, presenting the Goths as civilized guardians rather than barbarian conquerors was politically extremely useful. Theodoric's ideological message therefore operated on two levels. Personally, he could appear as a Roman-style princeps, a legitimate sovereign protecting law and order. Collectively, his Gothic warriors could appear as the military shield of the civilized world. The Goths were consequently positioned between traditional categories. They retained qualities admired in warrior societies, particularly courage and martial strength, but they were also credited with qualities that Roman intellectual tradition associated with civilized government. The result was not the abandonment of Gothic identity, but its elevation. The letter concerning Colossius provides one of the clearest examples of this strategy. Its language suggests that Gothic character combined two virtues usually assigned to different worlds. From the peoples beyond Rome came virtues: courage, strength, masculine military excellence, and the willingness to fight. From Rome came prudentia, judgment, intelligence, foresight, and political wisdom. The Goths, in this representation, possessed both. That combination allowed them to escape the weaknesses conventionally associated with either category. Other surviving political letters reinforce this distinction. When Theodoric addressed the unnamed king of the Heruli, whom he had symbolically accepted as a son through arms, weapons, and martial qualities naturally dominated the language of their relationship. Courage belonged to the vocabulary through which non-Roman peoples were often described. A similar contrast appears in correspondence connected with the later Gothic king Theodahad. When the Roman Senate appealed to Emperor Justinian on Theodahad's behalf, the king was represented as a man admired by Romans for his prudence while simultaneously commanding respect among other peoples because of his courage. This language was not accidental. It drew upon an old cultural stereotype deeply rooted in Greco-Roman ethnography. Barbarian peoples were frequently represented as physically powerful and remarkably brave, but their courage supposedly lacked intellectual discipline. They could charge fearlessly into battle while failing to calculate. Consequences. Roman civilization, by contrast, claimed qualities of judgment, restraint, organization, and rational government. Within this conceptual framework, courage without wisdom could easily become recklessness. A striking illustration appears in the writings of the 6th century historian Agathias of Myrina. He tells the story of Fulcaris, a Herulian commander serving the Eastern Roman Empire. Fulcaris is almost a perfect literary example of the stereotypical barbarian warrior. His bravery is never seriously questioned. What destroys him is his inability to combine courage with careful judgment. Before confronting the Franks, Fulcaris failed to take the precautions expected of an experienced commander. He did not properly investigate enemy movements or send adequate scouts ahead to discover what awaited his troops. Instead, he advanced confidently, trusting physical force and personal courage to overcome whatever opposition appeared. That confidence proved disastrous. The Franks prepared an ambush, caught the Heruli at a disadvantage, and inflicted heavy losses. Much of the Herulian force eventually escaped by retreating, but Fulcaris refused to abandon the battlefield. His bodyguards urged him to withdraw while escape remained possible. He rejected their advice, fearing the humiliation that would follow if he returned to his superior, the famous Eastern Roman commander Narses, after such a disastrous mistake. Fulcaris apparently preferred death to being condemned for his own foolishness. He remained in the fighting, killed several enemies, suffered multiple wounds, and was finally overwhelmed. Agathias used the episode to make a broader point about leadership. Fulcaris did not die because he lacked courage. He died because courage existed without an equal measure of wisdom. His personal bravery was extraordinary, but bravery alone could not compensate for poor judgment. In the intellectual world represented by Agathias, genuine military excellence required both qualities. Seen against this cultural background, Theodoric's presentation of the Goths becomes much more significant. If barbarians traditionally possessed courage without prudence, the Goths supposedly overcame that limitation by acquiring Roman wisdom. Their inherited virtues remained intact, but it was now disciplined by prudentia. They could therefore retain the qualities associated with successful warriors without sharing the intellectual deficiencies that Roman authors regularly attributed to uncivilized peoples. Yet the argument also works in the opposite direction. If the Goths had acquired Roman prudence, had the Romans themselves retained Gothic-style courage? The letter does not openly accuse the Romans of cowardice, nor does it explicitly state that Roman society had lost its ancient virtues. Nevertheless, such an implication would have been understandable to a late antique audience. By this period, the idea that Roman military decline resulted partly from the disappearance of ancestral courage had already become a familiar theme. Late Roman writers repeatedly worried that a civilization once built through discipline, endurance, and military excellence had become incapable of defending itself. Barbarian armies increasingly appeared within Roman territory, while soldiers recruited from non-Roman populations played an expanding role in imperial warfare. In such an environment, the contrast between Roman intelligence and barbarian martial strength could carry an uncomfortable message. Perhaps civilization had preserved its sophistication while losing the qualities necessary for its own defense. The historian Zosimus offered an especially dramatic expression of this anxiety in his account of Alaric's siege of Rome. During the crisis, precious statues were melted down, including an image representing Virtus, the personification of courage and excellence. Zosimus connected the destruction of this symbolic figure with the disappearance of Roman bravery itself. Whether taken literally or rhetorically, the episode captures the powerful late antique belief that Rome's military weakness reflected a deeper moral decline. Theodoric's Gothic ideology could therefore claim superiority in two directions simultaneously. Compared with stereotypical barbarians, the Goths possessed the intelligence and restraint associated with civilized society. Compared with contemporary Romans, they still possessed the martial courage necessary to defend that society. Rather than existing awkwardly between Rome and barbarism, they could be presented as combining the strongest characteristics of both. Such a construction offered enormous political advantages. The Goths no longer had to be understood as outsiders who had conquered the heartland of the Western Empire. They could instead appear as the people capable of preserving what remained of Roman civilization. Their military dominance was transformed from evidence of barbarian conquest into proof of their usefulness as Roman political culture supplied the wisdom and institutional framework. Gothic strength supplied the protection that allowed that civilization to survive. The concept of justice added another crucial element to this identity. In Theodoric's instructions to Colossius, Gothic government was not defined simply by military effectiveness. The Goths were also expected to demonstrate iustitia. This mattered because justice and respect for law were among the fundamental qualities through which Roman civilization distinguished itself from stereotypical barbarian disorder. By presenting Gothic rulers as defenders of the innocent and guardians of lawful government, Theodoric's regime could challenge the assumption that Gothic political dominance represented a retreat from Roman civilization. Other letters preserved in Cassiodorus's Variae develop this argument even further. When Theodoric addressed the provincial inhabitants of Gaul, he encouraged them to abandon what he described as barbarous behavior and cruelty of mind. They were expected gradually to adopt habits shaped by law. The message was unmistakable. Civilization was not determined simply by ancestry. It was demonstrated through conduct, legal order, restraint, and acceptance of institutions that protected society from arbitrary violence. For Theodoric, law represented security precisely because it limited personal power. People who could rely upon public rules did not have to live in constant fear of the unpredictable decisions of stronger individuals. Law protected the weak, restrained the powerful, and created stability for everyone. By contrast, a society governed according to personal desire rather than legal principles was portrayed as belonging to the world of gentilitas, a condition in which uncontrolled freedom ultimately produced insecurity and destruction. This ideological language effectively reversed the conventional relationship between Goth and Roman. The Gothic king was no longer the barbarian standing outside Roman civilization. He had become the ruler instructing others in civilized conduct. His government claimed responsibility for defending Roman law, protecting provincial populations, suppressing arbitrary violence, and maintaining political order. The Goths themselves could still celebrate their martial traditions, but those traditions were now presented as operating in the service of justice rather than against civilization. The Gothic identity promoted under Theodoric was therefore carefully balanced. It did not require the Goths to surrender their distinctiveness or pretend that they were simply another group of Romans. Their military reputation remained essential because it justified their special role within the kingdom. Yet that martial identity was reshaped through Roman political ideals. Courage was joined to prudence, strength to justice, and military power to law. This combination offered Theodoric an answer to one of the central political problems of post-imperial Italy. A Gothic ruling class could dominate territories that still understood themselves through Roman traditions only if Gothic authority could be made compatible with those traditions. The solution was not to deny the Goths' non-Roman origins, but to redefine what those origins meant. Gothic strength was no longer evidence of savagery. Properly disciplined by Roman wisdom and justice, it became the very quality that allowed the civilized order to survive. The result was an ethnographic identity shaped directly by political necessity. The Goths were portrayed neither as ordinary barbarians nor as Romans who had abandoned their ancestral character. They represented something more ambitious, a people claiming to unite the military virtues of the non-Roman world with the intellectual and legal achievements of Rome. In Theodoric's political imagination, this combination did more than place the Goths within civilization. It could present them as uniquely qualified to defend it. For Theodoric's government, law was more than an administrative instrument. It marked the boundary between civilization and barbarism. To live under established rules meant belonging to an ordered political world. To reject those rules was associated with gentilitas, the condition Roman writers commonly connected with peoples beyond civilized society. From this perspective, abandoning barbarian behavior required more than simply accepting Roman authority. It meant learning to think and act according to legal principles. This idea rested upon an old assumption that circulated widely in late antiquity. Truly, barbarian peoples either lacked proper laws or were incapable of submitting themselves to them. A revealing example survives in a tradition concerning the Visigothic king Atholf, who died in 415. He was said to have recognized that his own Goths were still too unruly to obey a stable legal system. Whether Atholf actually expressed the idea in precisely those terms is less important than what the story reveals about Roman expectations. Law represented discipline and civilization, while an inability to accept law remained one of the defining characteristics of barbarism. Theodoric's Goths were deliberately presented as the opposite of this stereotype. They were not merely capable of respecting Roman law. Their military presence in Italy was justified partly by their responsibility to protect the society governed by it. The distinction is especially clear in Theodoric's instructions to his sword-bearer Unigis. The king explained that the same people whom the Goths defended with weapons were people with whom they wished to live under Roman law. Military victories were meaningless if the society preserved by those victories could not continue to exist according to legal principles. Removing hostile barbarians from Roman territory accomplished little unless law and order survived after they had gone. This principle lay at the heart of the Gothic identity cultivated at Ravenna. The court did not portray the Goths simply as equal to the Romans. In certain respects, it presented them as an improved version of Roman society. The Goths supposedly possessed the prudence and political intelligence traditionally associated with Rome, but they also retained the martial virtues that contemporary ideological language increasingly associated with warrior peoples outside the Roman world. This combination allowed Gothic propaganda to explain both why the Goths were present in Italy and why their military dominance should be considered beneficial rather than destructive. Their courage, therefore, became a source of legitimacy. Cassiodorus could describe them as the traditional defenders of Pannonia Sirmiensis, while elsewhere, Gothic warriors were elevated to the status of defenders of Italy itself. Their weapons were not presented as instruments of conquest directed against Roman civilization. Instead, Gothic military strength was represented as the shield protecting Roman provinces from peoples who truly belonged to the barbarian world. The same logic shaped Theodoric's intervention in the conflict involving the Franks, Burgundians, and Visigoths after 507. When Ostrogothic forces entered the struggle in 508, their campaign could be explained not simply as an attempt to expand Theodoric's influence or preserve the Visigothic kingdom, but as an act of protection. The inhabitants of Gaul were also placed under Gothic defense. In instructions sent to Vandil, commander of the Ostrogothic garrison at Avignon, Theodoric demanded disciplined behavior from his soldiers. They were to live peacefully and in a civilized manner alongside the Roman population. Those whom Gothic armies claimed to rescue from enemy oppression were not to suffer abuse at the hands of their supposed liberators. This was an important distinction. A barbarian army might invade, plunder, and terrorize provincial communities. The Gothic army, according to Theodoric's political ideal, was supposed to do precisely the opposite. Its soldiers entered Roman territories to provide security. Their military strength protected civilian populations from external enemies, while their disciplined behavior demonstrated that Gothic warriors themselves did not belong among the barbarians they fought. Gothic virtues consequently became indispensable to the survival of Roman society. The Romans possessed institutions, laws, administrative traditions, and economic resources, but the Goths supplied the military strength required to protect them. This arrangement created a political system in which two distinct communities performed complementary functions. The Goths fought and defended. The Romans produced, paid taxes, and sustained the economic structure that supported the military establishment. Yet functional separation did not mean that one community belonged to civilization while the other remained outside it. Both Goths and Romans stood, at least within Theodoric's ideological framework, on the same side of the larger boundary separating the civilized world from gentilitas. The Goths were certainly warlike, but they were not barbaric. Their capacity for prudentia, obedience to law, and commitment to justice demonstrated that they possessed qualities supposedly unavailable to truly uncivilized peoples. This distinction had another significant consequence. If the Goths possessed the intellectual and moral characteristics of civilized societies, they could no longer be categorized simply as an external people living beyond the Roman political universe. They belonged within the Orbis Romanus. Their Gothic identity remained intact, but it had been repositioned geographically and conceptually. They were no longer outsiders pressing against the frontiers of Rome. They had become participants in the Roman world and guardians of its internal order. Even the circumstances surrounding Theodoric's original expedition into Italy could be interpreted according to this principle. When the Eastern Emperor Zeno authorized Theodoric's movement against Odoacer in 489, later tradition represented the mission as one undertaken for the defense of Italy. The anonymous Valesianus describes Theodoric as having been sent to protect the peninsula on the emperor's behalf. This interpretation provided a convenient foundation for later Ostrogothic ideology. The Gothic occupation of Italy could be presented not as the destruction of imperial authority, but as the fulfillment of a defensive responsibility originally entrusted to Theodoric by the Roman emperor himself. Theodoric's political system therefore depended upon an intriguing balance. He preserved a clear distinction between Goths and Romans and had no interest in making the two identities completely interchangeable. At the same time, the ideology produced around his court prevented Gothic distinctiveness from becoming synonymous with barbarism. The Goths were different from the Romans, but they still belonged to Romanitas. Their difference was functional and cultural rather than a sign that they existed beyond civilization. The Langobards developed their identity under very different circumstances. Their surviving origin tradition does not attempt to place them comfortably inside the Roman world. Instead, it emphasizes distance from that world. Where Theodoric's political language brought Gothic identity closer to Romanitas, the Langobard tradition could define itself through an explicit connection with a non-Roman past. The central text for understanding this process is the Origo Gentis Langobardorum. Its exact circumstances of composition remain debated. Some historians have suggested that it was produced when King Grimoald introduced additions to the Edictum Rothari, the Great Langobard Law Code originally issued in 643. Another possibility is that Grimoald's successor Perctarit later revised or expanded the narrative. This could explain why one surviving form of the tradition concludes with Grimoald, while another carries the royal sequence forward to Perctarit. Whatever the precise circumstances, the broader political environment is easier to identify. The text emerged while the Langobard kingdom was engaged in conflict with the Eastern Roman Empire, beginning in 663 and perhaps reaching a formal conclusion only around 680. The Origo was therefore not recorded in a political vacuum. Its account of the distant Langobard past appeared at a moment when questions of collective identity, political loyalty, and opposition to external enemies had immediate significance. This raises a larger question about early medieval origin traditions. Stories about ancestral migrations, legendary founders, divine intervention, and heroic victories were rarely preserved simply because people were curious about remote antiquity. Such narratives could perform important functions for the communities that transmitted them. They explained why a people existed, what made it distinctive, and how its present position could be connected to a meaningful past. The Origo does exactly this for the Langobards. Its famous story of the struggle against the Vandals explains not only an ancestral victory, but also the origin of the people's name and their most recognizable physical symbol, their long beards. The narrative therefore combines military success, divine favor, collective identity, and physical appearance into a single explanation of Langobard distinctiveness. The question is whether such a story had an active political function in 7th century Italy. Perhaps it merely preserved an old legend whose original significance had faded. But another possibility is much more revealing. The story may have operated as a deliberate counter-image to the identities claimed by the Langobards' enemies. In that case, the northern origin of the Langobards and their conspicuous rejection of a Mediterranean ancestry would have carried an ideological message appropriate to the conflicts of their own age. The 7th century was filled with attempts to organize the past of entire peoples. The Langobards were far from unique in their fascination with origins. In the Frankish kingdoms, a tradition connecting the Franks with ancient Troy gained increasing prominence. Around 660, the chronicler conventionally known as Fredegar recorded a version of this story, although he almost certainly did not invent the tradition himself. Earlier in the century, Isidore of Seville had constructed his own account of Gothic origins in the different versions of his Historia Gothorum. Across post-Roman Europe, political communities were looking backward in order to explain themselves. The Langobards participated fully in this broader movement. Their origin story answered several fundamental questions at once. It identified the distant homeland from which their ancestors had emerged, explained how the people received the name by which they were known, and illustrated the qualities that supposedly distinguished them from other communities. Those answers were provided through a memorable story set in a remote northern landscape. According to the Origo, far to the north stood an island called Scadanan, populated by numerous peoples. Among them lived a relatively small community known as the Winili. Their modest numbers soon became important because they faced a much more threatening opponent, the Vandals, commanded by two leaders named Ambri and Assi. The Vandals demanded submission. The Winili could pay tribute and accept their subordinate position, or they could refuse and prepare for war. Their leaders were Gambara and her sons Ibor and Agio. Rather than surrender, they chose resistance. The decision immediately defines the Winili through courage and independence. Faced with the possibility of domination by a stronger enemy, they preferred the danger of battle to the humiliation of tribute. But the conflict was not decided by military preparation alone. Both sides sought supernatural assistance. Ambri and Assi appealed to Woden and asked the god to grant them victory. Woden responded with a condition. Victory would belong to whichever people he saw first when the sun rose. Gambara and her sons sought help elsewhere. They approached Freya, Wodan's wife, and persuaded her to support the Winili. Freya devised an ingenious strategy. The Winili women were to accompany the men and arrange their long hair across their faces so that it resembled beards. The entire community would then assemble where Woden could see them at sunrise. As morning approached, Freya turned Woden's bed toward the east and awakened him. Looking toward the rising sun, Woden saw the assembled Winili together with their women, whose loosened hair gave them the appearance of bearded warriors. Surprised by the sight, he asked who these Longbeards were. Freya immediately exploited his words. Since Woden himself had effectively given the people a new name, she argued, he should also grant them victory. Bound by the logic of the story, Woden did exactly that. The Winili defeated their enemies, avenged themselves upon the Vandals, and emerged from the confrontation under a new identity. From that moment onward, the narrative explains, they were known as the Langobards, the Longbeards. The episode has often been interpreted as the survival of an authentic Langobard myth from a much earlier period. That possibility cannot be excluded, but concentrating entirely on the remote origins of the legend risks overlooking the historical setting in which it was finally written down. A story can be ancient and still acquire a new political meaning centuries later. What matters is not only where the tradition began, but why 7th century Langobards considered it worth preserving. The timing is especially striking. Beginning in 663, the Langobards fought enemies who possessed their own powerful narratives of ancestry. Two of the most important were the Eastern Romans and the Franks. Both could connect themselves, directly or indirectly, to one of the most prestigious places in the ancient Mediterranean imagination: Troy. Among the Franks, the claim of Trojan descent became increasingly visible during the 7th century. This tradition accomplished something politically significant. First, it connected Frankish history with Roman history by giving both peoples a common ancestral homeland. If Romans and Franks had emerged from the same Trojan past, they could be imagined as distant relatives rather than fundamentally alien communities. Second, Trojan ancestry relocated Frankish origins away from the supposedly barbarian lands east of the Rhine and into the prestigious cultural geography of the Eastern Mediterranean. The implications were substantial. Instead of beginning their history in the forests beyond Rome's old frontier, the Franks could place themselves inside the legendary history of the classical world. Troy offered antiquity, prestige, and a connection to Rome itself. The myth did not merely explain where the Franks came from, it changed the cultural meaning of their origins. The Romans already possessed an even older and more deeply rooted relationship with Trojan ancestry. The story of Aeneas had long connected Rome with the survivors of Troy, and this tradition remained meaningful in the Eastern Roman Empire. During the reign of Justinian in the 6th century, imperial political language could trace the history of Roman government back to Aeneas. Later, Byzantine historians continued to treat the Trojan past as part of Roman history. The fall of Troy could function as a distant starting point for the story that ultimately produced Rome. Why then did Frankish writers become increasingly interested in the same ancestry? One possible explanation lies in diplomacy. During the 7th century, Romans and Franks had political reasons to emphasize their similarities, especially when confronting a common enemy in Italy. The Langobards presented precisely such a threat. Claims of shared ancestry could make political cooperation appear natural. In societies where kinship carried enormous social and moral weight, diplomacy could borrow the language of family relationships. Two peoples believed to descend from the same ancestors could describe an alliance not simply as a temporary calculation of interests, but as cooperation between relatives. Shared blood transformed political convenience into something resembling inherited obligation. There were precedents for this kind of reasoning. During the 4th century, traditions circulated connecting the Burgundians with Roman ancestry. Although the surviving evidence does not always explain exactly what this relationship meant, some historians have suggested that Roman observers may have understood the Burgundians as belonging to the wider Trojan genealogical tradition. Such claims appeared in a political context in which Emperor Valentinian I sought Burgundian assistance against the Alemanni. An imagined relationship between peoples could therefore reinforce a very practical military alliance. Something similar may have occurred centuries later. If Romans and Franks confronted the Langobards as a common enemy, emphasizing a shared Trojan ancestry could strengthen the ideological foundation of their cooperation. Their alliance could be represented as the reunion of peoples descended from the same ancient world. Seen from this perspective, the Origo Gentis Langobardorum becomes particularly fascinating. Perhaps the Langobards answered the Mediterranean genealogies of their opponents not by inventing their own connection to Troy, but by moving deliberately in the opposite direction. Instead of claiming participation in Roman antiquity, they emphasized an origin beyond it. Scadanon stood far to the north. It belonged not to the Mediterranean geography of Troy, Rome, and Constantinople, but to a legendary northern world associated with peoples outside Roman civilization. By locating their ancestral homeland there, the Langobards placed the beginning of their history firmly within a non-Roman geographical imagination. Other early medieval traditions reveal how powerful such northern geography could be. The historian Jordanes, writing in the 6th century, described the Goths as having emerged from a northern island called Scanza or Scandia. In the 8th century, a tradition concerning the Burgundians similarly placed their origins on an island known as Scanadavia. Such distant northern homelands formed part of an alternative map of ancestry, one sharply separated from the Mediterranean world. Jordanes' description of Scanza makes the symbolism particularly clear. The region was imagined as a remote environment inhabited by extraordinarily fierce peoples. Its inhabitants surpassed even the Germani in physical power and ferocity, characteristics that Roman literary tradition had long associated with uncivilized societies. This was not simply another province at the edge of civilization, it represented an almost inverted image of the Roman world. The Mediterranean stood for cities, law, inherited institutions, classical culture, and political order. The legendary North could represent physical strength, wildness, remoteness, and freedom from Roman civilization. Locating a people's ancestors in one region or the other therefore communicated far more than geographical information. It positioned that people within a moral and political landscape. The contrast between the Langobards and their enemies could hardly have been sharper. Romans and Franks traced their ancestry toward Troy and therefore toward the ancient Mediterranean. The Langobards looked northward toward a world beyond the civilized Orbis. Their story did not attempt to minimize this difference. It made the difference fundamental to their identity. This allows the Origo to be read as a possible response to the Roman and Frankish narratives surrounding the Langobards. If the Franks could strengthen their relationship with the Romans by emphasizing common Trojan ancestry, the Langobards could define themselves through precisely the opposite claim. They did not share the same cradle. They came from somewhere else entirely. Their non-Roman origin could therefore become a source of political distinctiveness rather than an embarrassment to be concealed. As scholars such as Francesco Borri have argued, the Langobard elite may have consciously developed an understanding of its past that emphasized its barbarian and non-Mediterranean character. In this interpretation, remoteness from Rome was not a deficiency. It was part of what made the Langobards who they were. Such an identity can be understood as a form of counter-identity. Roman and Frankish narratives moved toward convergence. Troy connected them through common descent. Langobard tradition moved toward separation. Scadanan established distance and provided an ancestral geography incompatible with the Mediterranean genealogy claimed by their enemies. Origin myths could therefore function almost like political borders. The boundary existed not on a physical map, but within collective memory. Troy connected communities, Scadanan separated them. By choosing different ancestral landscapes, peoples could communicate whom they considered relatives, whom they regarded as outsiders, and where they believed they belonged within the larger political world. This makes the northern origin of the Langobards more than a picturesque detail from an old legend. It becomes what might be described as a boundary-making structure within their identity. The story placed a conceptual frontier between the Langobards and the Roman Frankish world confronting them. Their enemies looked toward a shared Mediterranean ancestry, while the Langobards claimed a past beyond that civilization. Yet geography was only one element of this boundary. The Origo also gave extraordinary importance to physical appearance. The decisive moment in the ancestral story was the transformation of the Winili into the Longbeards. Their new name emerged from the sight of hair arranged like beards, and that image became permanently connected with the identity of the people. This leads to an equally important question. If the northern homeland distinguished the Langobards from the Mediterranean ancestry of Romans and Franks, could the beard have performed a similar function in visible, everyday life? Perhaps Longbeards were not simply a legendary explanation for an unusual ethnic name. They may also have served as a recognizable sign through which Langobards imagined, displayed, and maintained the boundary between themselves and the peoples around them. By the 7th century, however, another fascinating development complicated the symbolic meaning of the Langobard beard. Their principal enemies, the Eastern Romans, were themselves undergoing a visible cultural transformation. During much of the 6th century, Roman men had generally been represented as clean-shaven. In the following century, that appearance changed dramatically. Beards became increasingly common, especially among members of the imperial elite, and the Eastern Roman world began to acquire the visual character of a society dominated by bearded men. One of the most important figures in this transformation was Emperor Constans II, who ruled from 641 to 668 and became so closely associated with his appearance that later tradition remembered him as the Bearded. The evidence from coinage is especially striking. From approximately 651 onward, imperial coins portrayed Constans with an unusually large and prominent beard. This was not a minor alteration in artistic style. Imperial portraits were carefully controlled political images, which raises the possibility that facial hair itself carried a deliberate message. Throughout late antiquity, the beard could function as a visible symbol of masculinity. Ancient and Christian writers alike could associate facial hair with adulthood, virility, maturity, and male authority. Jerome expressed the connection very directly when he described the beard as an indication of manhood. Within this cultural framework, the increasingly elaborate beards of 7th century Eastern Roman men may have communicated something more than personal fashion. The reasons behind this transformation remain debated. One interpretation links the new appearance to the broader Hellenization and Christianization of the Eastern Roman Empire. During the 7th century, Roman political culture was changing rapidly. Latin gradually lost ground to Greek in many areas of government and public life. Christian symbolism became even more deeply embedded in imperial identity, and the empire itself faced a series of profound military and territorial crises. These pressures may help explain why masculinity became increasingly important in imperial imagery. The 7th century brought devastating wars, territorial losses, and threats to the very survival of the state. Under such conditions, the cultivation of a visibly masculine appearance could have functioned as a public response to insecurity. A large beard might project resilience, maturity, strength, and determination at precisely the moment when the empire needed to display those qualities most urgently. If this interpretation is correct, then the Eastern Roman beard was not merely decorative. It became part of a cultural language through which masculinity and perhaps Christian imperial identity were communicated. This makes the Langobard tradition especially intriguing because the Origo Gentis Langobardorum gave the beard a completely different origin. In the Langobard story, the beard was rooted not in Christianity, but in a legendary pagan past. The Winili did not acquire their defining appearance through Christian emperors, saints, or biblical symbolism. Their transformation emerged from the world of Wodan and Freya. Freya devised the strategy that made the Winili women appear bearded, while Wodan's reaction gave the people their new name and ultimately their victory. This contrast raises the possibility that the Origo was doing more than explaining an unusual tribal name. If Roman beards had become associated with Christian masculinity, the Langobard story deliberately located its own symbolic facial hair in a pre-Christian religious world. The difference could have reinforced the cultural distance between the two peoples. Roman beards belonged to one ideological system. Langobard beards belonged to another. There is no way to prove that the author of the Origo consciously constructed the story as a direct response to Eastern Roman beard symbolism. Yet, the broader political atmosphere makes the possibility worth considering. During the 7th century, the Langobard kingdom appears to have experienced what some scholars describe as a barbarian turn, a renewed emphasis on forms of identity that highlighted the kingdom's distance from the Roman and Mediterranean world. Within that environment, the pagan origin of the Langobard beard could have become meaningful precisely because it was not Roman and not Christian. Rather than hiding the community's non-Roman past, the story placed that past at the center of Langobard identity. The old gods, the northern homeland, the confrontation with the Vandals, and the unusual appearance of the Winili all reinforced an image of a people whose origins lay outside the cultural world claimed by their enemies. The story contains another remarkable detail. The original artificial beards were not placed on the faces of Winili men. They were created by the women, who arranged their long hair around their faces before Woden saw the community at sunrise. That detail transforms the meaning of the episode. If the beard represented masculinity and virility, then the narrative symbolically extended masculine identity across the entire community. Even the women temporarily carried the visible sign traditionally associated with male strength. The story could therefore suggest something stronger than ordinary masculinity. The entire Langobard people, rather than only its warriors, was presented as saturated with the characteristics of manhood. In that sense, the legend may communicate a kind of collective hypermasculinity. The masculine quality of the Langobards was not restricted to adult men standing in battle formation. It encompassed the whole people. Their women participated directly in the strategy that created the ethnic identity of the community, and they did so by adopting the visual marker most strongly connected with virility. Yet masculinity was only one possible meaning of the beard. Victory was equally important. The appearance of the artificial beards occurred at the exact moment when the Winili ceased to be merely one small people among many and became the Langobards. Their new identity was born together with their first great military triumph. The relationship between name and victory is fundamental. Wodan saw the transformed community, named them the Longbeards, and then granted them victory over the Vandals. Ethnic identity and military success therefore emerged simultaneously. The Langobards did not simply possess a name before entering history. According to the logic of the story, they became a distinct people through victory. This idea gives the beard another layer of symbolism. It represented not only masculine appearance, but also the capacity to defeat enemies. The sign that made the Winili recognizable to Wodan was the same sign that preceded their triumph. Their characteristic appearance and their reputation for victory became inseparable. This connection between collective identity and military success was particularly significant in early medieval political culture. Victory could legitimize rulers, dynasties, and entire communities. For the Langobards, the Origo suggested that victoriousness belonged not merely to one exceptional king or commander, but to the people themselves. The ability to overcome enemies became an inherited characteristic embedded in the story of their beginnings. The symbolism was especially powerful because their first victory came against an aggressive opponent. The Vandals demanded tribute and attempted to impose their authority upon the Winili. By refusing submission and ultimately defeating them, the ancestors of the Langobards established independence through resistance. The community's birth was therefore associated with a refusal to be dominated. Their defining beard consequently gathered several meanings into a single symbol. It represented masculinity because facial hair traditionally marked male maturity and virility. It represented collective strength because even Langobarд women participated in the visual transformation. And it represented victory because the appearance of the beards directly preceded the defeat of the Vandals and the creation of the Langobarд name. Seen in this way, the Origo may preserve far more than a charming myth explaining why the Langobards were called the Longbeards. It offered a compact political portrait of the community itself. The Langobards were people of northern and non-Roman origin, associated with pagan ancestral traditions marked by extreme masculinity, and destined to achieve victory against enemies who attempted to dominate them. Such a portrait would have been particularly useful in the second half of the 7th century. The kingdom faced pressure from powerful neighbors, especially the Eastern Romans and the Franks. Both opponents possessed prestigious political traditions and could appeal to Mediterranean and Trojan ancestry. The Langobards answered, whether consciously or indirectly, with a very different vision of collective legitimacy. Rather than attempting to imitate Roman historical prestige, their origin narrative emphasized separation from it. Their ancestors did not emerge from Troy. Their identity was not built around participation in the classical Mediterranean world. They came from the distant north, from a landscape associated with peoples outside the Roman cultural sphere. The same contrast appeared in the symbolism of facial hair. Both Eastern Romans and Langobards could use beards to communicate masculine strength, yet they attached different histories to that appearance. Roman facial hair could be understood within an increasingly Christian imperial culture, while Langobard tradition traced its defining beard to a legendary confrontation involving Wodan and Freya. The similarity of appearance, therefore, did not erase the ideological distinction. On the contrary, two societies could use the same physical sign while assigning radically different meanings to it. Among the Romans, the beard might express Christianized imperial masculinity in an age of military crisis. Among the Langobards, it could evoke pagan ancestry, collective virility, and the primordial victory that had created the people themselves. This comparison helps illuminate a broader characteristic of early medieval identity. Ethnic distinctions were not maintained solely through language, ancestry, or political borders. They could also be expressed through stories, physical appearance, clothing, hairstyles, military roles, and collective memories. Any of these elements could become a marker separating one community from another. Both Ostrogothic and Langobard identities can therefore be understood as forms of boundary making. They established what might be called conceptual frontiers between communities. These frontiers were not necessarily physical and did not require populations to live separately. Instead, they defined which characteristics made one people different from its neighbors. In the Ostrogothic kingdom of Theoderic, those boundaries were constructed through qualities of character. The Goths were distinguished from uncivilized peoples because they supposedly possessed prudentia, the wisdom and judgment associated with Roman civilization. Yet, they were simultaneously differentiated from the Romans because they retained virtues, the courage and martial strength required to defend the state. This combination created a carefully balanced identity. The Goths remained Goths because they possessed military characteristics that separated them from the Roman civilian population. At the same time, their acceptance of law, justice, prudence, and civilized government separated them from genuine barbarians. They occupied an intermediate position, but one that Gothic propaganda presented as superior rather than ambiguous. The Langobards constructed their distinction differently. Their most powerful marker was not the combination of Roman and non-Roman virtues, but the geographical and cultural location of their beginnings. Their ancestry led away from the Mediterranean and into the distant north. In contrast with Franks and Romans who could connect themselves to Troy, Langobard tradition emphasized an origin outside the Roman world. This divergence is especially important because it would be misleading to imagine Langobard identity simply as a continuation of Theodoric's earlier Gothic model. Both kingdoms ruled substantial Roman populations in Italy, and both had to negotiate the relationship between Germanic ruling groups and Roman traditions. Yet the ideological solutions they developed were fundamentally different. Theodoric's court emphasized distinction while simultaneously incorporating the Goths into Romanitas. Gothic identity was carefully preserved, but it was presented as compatible with the Roman civilized order. Indeed, the political rhetoric preserved in Cassiodorus's Variae could go even further and portray the Goths as possessing advantages that contemporary Romans lacked. They had Roman prudence without sacrificing Gothic courage. They could obey Roman law while retaining the military qualities required to defend it. In this formulation, the Goths were not failed Romans or civilized barbarians awkwardly imitating Rome. They could be imagined as a strengthened version of Roman society itself. The Langobard narrative moved in almost the opposite direction. The Origo did not seek to demonstrate that the Langobards had always belonged to Roman civilization. Instead, it deliberately located the beginning of the community in a pagan and barbarian landscape. Their identity gained power from its separation from Rome rather than from its proximity to it. The northern homeland, the confrontation with the Vandals, the intervention of Wodan and Freya, and the creation of the Longbeard name all belong to a world outside Christian Roman history. Instead of eliminating these elements as embarrassing remnants of a pagan past, the narrative preserved them at the heart of the story, explaining who the Langobards were. This difference captures the fundamental contrast between the two ideological systems. Ostrogothic identity argued that the Goths should not be regarded as barbarians. Langobard identity was far more willing to make use of a past that was explicitly non-Roman and deeply connected with the barbarian world. Yet beneath this contrast lies an important similarity. Both identities were constructed through distinction. They told their audiences not merely who the Goths or Langobards were, but who they were not. Gothic prudence separated the Goths from barbarians, while Gothic courage separated them from Romans. Langobard northern ancestry separated the Langobards from both Eastern Romans and Franks, whose own genealogies pointed toward the Mediterranean. The same principle can be seen in the Langobard beard. Whether interpreted as a sign of masculinity, victoriousness, pagan ancestry, or all three at once, it helped create a recognizable symbolic boundary around the community. It transformed physical appearance into a statement about collective character. These identities should therefore not be understood as fixed ethnic realities that had survived unchanged from an ancient past. They were flexible political constructions shaped by the needs of particular moments. Theodoric's Goths required an identity capable of legitimizing their military dominance within a Roman political environment. 7th century Langobards required an identity capable of distinguishing them from powerful Roman and Frankish enemies. Each society answered that challenge differently. The Ostrogoths moved symbolically toward Rome without surrendering their Gothic distinctiveness. The Langobards turned toward a deliberately non-Roman past and transformed that distance into a source of collective pride. Ultimately, both examples demonstrate how powerfully early medieval communities could reshape memory in order to define themselves. Origins, virtues, laws, warfare, physical appearance, and religious traditions all became materials from which collective identities could be constructed. The stories told about a people's past were therefore never simply stories about where that people had come from. They also explained where that people believed it belonged in the political world of the present. By the beginning of the 14th century, the mysterious equestrian monument known as the Regisol had already accumulated a complicated history of legends, mistaken identifications, and competing explanations about its origins. One of the earliest medieval writers to connect the statue explicitly with Ravenna was Ricobaldo of Ferrara, a notary and chronicler active in the early 1300s. According to him, the monument had originally stood in Ravenna and had later been removed by Charlemagne, who supposedly intended to carry it north across the Alps. Ricobaldo claimed that this plan was never completed and that the statue ultimately remained in Pavia. The problem is that Ricobaldo appears to have confused the Regisole with a completely different equestrian monument. His account seems to derive from information preserved by Agnellus of Ravenna, but the statue described by Agnellus was not the same object that later stood in Pavia. Agnellus was referring instead to a famous bronze equestrian image of Theoderic the Great that once stood before the main entrance of the royal palace at Ravenna. According to the story, Charlemagne encountered this monument after his imperial coronation. On his journey back north, he was so impressed by the bronze figure that he ordered it to be removed and transported to Aachen. The statue portrayed Theodoric on horseback, armed in a distinctly martial fashion. He carried a lance in one hand and a shield in the other, presenting the Gothic ruler not simply as a king, but as a mounted warrior and military sovereign. There is good reason to believe that this particular monument really did reach Aachen. In 829, the scholar and poet Walafrid Strabo composed his De Imagine Tetrici, a poem inspired by the equestrian statue he could see there. His testimony confirms that the monument removed from Ravenna by Charlemagne ended up at the Carolingian court. This immediately creates an important distinction. The Theodoric statue transported to Aachen cannot have been the same object as the Regisole that became famous in Pavia. Ravenna must therefore have possessed at least two important equestrian monuments associated directly or indirectly with Theodoric. Further evidence appears only a few years after Ricobaldo. The chronicler Benzo d'Alessandria also stated that the Regisole had come from Ravenna. Unlike Ricobaldo, however, Benzo did not identify the person responsible for its transfer to Pavia. Instead, he claimed that chronicles belonging to the Church of Ravenna described the monument as having been commissioned by Theodoric and placed on what he called the Pons Austri. This location probably refers to the Augustus Bridge. The strange form Austri may simply reflect a misunderstanding of an abbreviation for Augusti. The bridge occupied an important position in Ravenna's urban landscape, linking the capital and forum with the district associated with the imperial residence. If Benzo's information preserves a genuine local tradition, the Regisole therefore stood not at Theodoric's palace entrance, but in another prominent monumental area closer to the forum. Benzo also provides one of the earliest surviving forms of the statue's famous name. He calls it res solium, a form that does not seem to have remained in later usage. By the middle of the 14th century, the Dominican chronicler Jacopo d'Acqui recorded another version, regit solum, a phrase that could be understood as meaning that the statue somehow directed the sun. Jacopo even supplied an explanation for this peculiar name. According to him, the monument contained a mechanical device that allowed it to turn in the direction of the sun. Later tradition would associate this extraordinary mechanism with Boethius. Whether such a device ever existed is highly doubtful, but the story shows how the Regisole had already become surrounded by technological and legendary associations during the Middle Ages. Like Benzo, Jacopo connected the monument with Theodoric. He also placed it on a column near Ravenna's forum. Although the description is vague, it corresponds surprisingly well with Benzo's reference to the Augustus Bridge, which also stood close to the forum. Even the medieval geography of Ravenna may preserve a faint memory of the monument's original location. The district around the forum and Augustus Bridge continued to carry names resembling that of the Regisole centuries later. A document from 1002 refers to a house situated in a district called Radiasole, near the Basilica of San Paterniano. Another document dating from 1127 refers to a region called Radianti Soli, adjoining a public square. Taken together, these clues make it increasingly plausible that Ravenna once possessed two separate monumental equestrian images connected with Theodoric. The first stood directly before the principal entrance to his palace. It represented the king armed with shield and lance and was eventually carried away by Charlemagne to Aachen. The second stood somewhere near the Augustus Bridge and the Forum and became associated with the names Regisol or Radiosol. Understanding this distinction is essential because the Regisol itself seems to have looked very different from the martial Theoderic monument carried to Aachen. The surviving images of the Regisol, although produced long after antiquity, consistently depict a bearded mounted ruler dressed not for battle but for ceremonial display. The rider wore a short-sleeved tunic beneath a cloak fastened at the right shoulder. His left hand controlled the horse's reins, while his right arm was raised outward in the familiar Roman gesture of ad locutio, the formal gesture used by emperors when addressing troops or subjects. The horse itself was shown moving forward at a measured trot rather than charging into battle. This pose immediately recalls the famous bronze equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, today preserved on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. Indeed, modern scholars have generally identified the Regisol as a representation of Marcus Aurelius, or at least as a work closely modeled upon the established visual type associated with that emperor. The resemblance goes beyond the raised hand of the rider. Another notable parallel is the presence of elaborate horse furniture or caparison. Such equipment, possibly reflecting Persian influence, was relatively uncommon in Roman equestrian monuments. Its appearance in both the Regisol tradition and comparable imperial imagery has strengthened the association with the world of Roman imperial representation. Nevertheless, scholars and antiquarians have proposed many different identifications over the centuries. The mounted figure has variously been interpreted as Antoninus Pius, Commodus, Septimius Severus, and even Theodoric himself. Renaissance scholars in particular attempted to reconcile the visible features of the statue with different rulers known from ancient and late antique history. One major source of confusion was the presence of stirrups and spurs. These details seemed difficult to reconcile with a classical Roman imperial monument and therefore encouraged some researchers to date the Regisol much later, perhaps to the late 5th or 6th century. If the statue genuinely belonged to that period, identifying the rider as Theodoric would become much easier. Yet these supposedly decisive features may not have belonged to the original sculpture at all. The stirrups and spurs were probably added during late antiquity or the Middle Ages, as the statue was altered to suit new audiences and new interpretations. There is an even clearer example of such modification beneath the horse itself. Later, images show a small dog rising under the horse's raised front leg. This animal almost certainly replaced an earlier figure. In Roman imperial equestrian monuments, the space beneath the horse could contain the image of a defeated barbarian or the personification of a conquered province. The medieval dog was therefore probably the result of a much later intervention. Once these additions are recognized as secondary, the argument that the Regisol was originally created as a portrait of Theodoric becomes much weaker. Its fundamental design fits Roman imperial statuary far better than the visual culture of 6th century Gothic kingship. Yet Theodoric remains extraordinarily persistent in the written tradition surrounding the monument. Medieval sources repeatedly connect him with the Regisol, using expressions that appear to say that he made, constructed, or had built the statue. At first glance, these statements seem to identify him as the ruler who commissioned it. Cesare Saletti offered a more subtle interpretation. Such expressions need not necessarily mean that Theodoric ordered an entirely new statue to be produced. They might instead mean that he had an existing monument altered, arranged, restored, or adapted for a new political purpose. This possibility fits well with what is known about Theodoric's relationship with ancient Roman monuments. His government consciously reused the artistic and architectural heritage of the empire. Ancient materials, sculptures, and prestigious objects could be transferred from Rome and incorporated into Ravenna, the political center of the Ostrogothic kingdom. Rome still contained numerous equestrian statues during this period. If the Regisol was one of them, Theodoric could easily have ordered its relocation to Ravenna. Once installed in his capital, an older Roman imperial monument could acquire a completely new political meaning without requiring the expensive creation of a new bronze sculpture. The possibility becomes even more interesting if the Regisol really was a smaller copy or close imitation of the equestrian Marcus Aurelius. The surviving evidence concerning the quantity of bronze recovered after the Regisol was eventually destroyed suggests that it was smaller than the Capitoline monument. Nevertheless, the resemblance may have been unmistakable. By bringing such a statue to Ravenna, Theodoric could have appropriated one of the most powerful symbols of Roman imperial authority. Rome would retain the original or larger counterpart, while Ravenna possessed its own equivalent. The symbolism would have suited a city increasingly presenting itself as an imperial capital and, in ideological terms, almost a second Rome. The monument could therefore function on several levels simultaneously. It preserved the artistic language of Roman emperorship, enhanced the monumental prestige of Ravenna, and perhaps associated Theodoric's rule with the authority of ancient Roman sovereigns. Over time, that association may have become so powerful that viewers stopped distinguishing between the original emperor, represented by the statue, and the Gothic king who had appropriated it. A curious piece of 12th century evidence strengthens this possibility. Master Gregory, an English visitor to Rome, reported that pilgrims sometimes identified the famous equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius not as Constantine, the name traditionally associated with it in medieval Rome, but as Theodoric. This is remarkable because medieval Romans themselves generally believed that the Capitoline horseman represented Constantine. That mistaken identification helped save the statue from destruction, since Constantine was remembered as the first Christian emperor. Yet some northern visitors apparently saw something different. They recognized Theodoric. Why would they do so? The Regisol may provide an explanation. If pilgrims traveling from northern Italy or regions beyond the Alps were familiar with the great equestrian statue at Pavia and believed that its rider was Theodoric, then the extraordinary visual similarity between that monument and the Marcus Aurelius statue in Rome could easily produce the same identification. Standing before the Roman bronze, they may simply have recognized the image they already associated with the Gothic king. If this interpretation is correct, the Regisol did not merely acquire Theodoric's identity locally. It helped reshape the way medieval viewers interpreted another of antiquity's most famous surviving monuments. An equally fascinating piece of evidence comes from Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo visited Pavia at least twice, in 1488 and again in 1490, giving him the opportunity to study the Regisole directly. Like many artists, he was particularly interested in the horse. A drawing preserved in the Codex Atlanticus appears among Leonardo's preparatory studies for the unrealized equestrian monument to the military commander Gian Giacomo Trivulzio. The connection suggests that the Regisole served as a practical, artistic model for one of Renaissance Italy's greatest observers of equine anatomy and monumental sculpture. But another detail is even more revealing. On one page of the Codex appears a Latin phrase identifying Theodoricus Rex and associating him with imperial authority and the welfare of the state. Already in the 19th century, scholars suggested that Leonardo, or someone working around him, may have copied these words from an inscription attached to the Regisole's supporting column. If that interpretation is correct, by Leonardo's lifetime, the connection between the monument and Theodoric was not merely an oral legend circulating among local inhabitants. It had become physically inscribed into the monumental setting itself. Determining exactly when this transformation occurred is impossible. There is no surviving document that records the moment when people first stopped seeing the rider as a Roman emperor and began identifying him as Theodoric. Master Gregory's 12th century account provides a useful chronological limit, demonstrating that the association was already established by then. The process, however, may have started much earlier in Ravenna. Few cities possessed stronger memories of Theodoric. His palace, churches, mausoleum, building projects, and political legacy remained deeply embedded in Ravenna's urban environment long after the Ostrogothic kingdom disappeared. The existence of another, unquestionably Theodorican equestrian statue in front of the royal palace would have strengthened this association even further. It is therefore easy to imagine how an older imperial horseman, standing elsewhere in the city, gradually became absorbed into the memory of Theodoric. A Roman emperor could slowly become a Gothic king through repeated reinterpretation. This transformation matters enormously when considering how and why the Regisol eventually reached Pavia. If the statue had already become identified with Theodoric before its removal from Ravenna, transporting it would not have been equivalent to moving an anonymous ancient bronze. Whoever took possession of it would also be appropriating the symbolic image of one of the most powerful rulers of post-Roman Italy. In this respect, the Regisol's transfer can be compared with Charlemagne's removal of the genuine Theodoric monument to Aachen. Charlemagne did not simply acquire valuable bronze. By placing Theodoric's monumental image within his own political center, he appropriated something of the prestige and memory associated with the Gothic ruler. The same reasoning may help explain the arrival of the Regisola in Pavia. The key questions are therefore not simply where the statue came from, but when it was moved, who ordered the transfer, and what political message that action was intended to communicate. The possibility that Theodoric himself first moved the Regisol directly from Ravenna to Pavia is difficult to sustain. If, as the evidence suggests, he had already transported the monument from Rome to Ravenna, there is little reason to assume that he then transferred it again to Pavia. The more plausible explanations place the move later. Two broad possibilities remain. The statue may have been taken to Pavia during the 8th century on the initiative of a Langobard ruler. Alternatively, it may have arrived during the 9th or 10th century as the result of military conflict or political rivalry between Pavia and Ravenna. Distinguishing between these possibilities is frustratingly difficult because one of the most important sources for early medieval Ravenna says nothing about the Regisole. Agnellus composed his Liber Pontificalis Ecclesiae Ravennatis during the 830s and 840s, producing an extraordinary history of Ravenna through the biographies of its bishops. Agnellus knew Pavia personally. He visited the palace that Theodoric had built there and recorded seeing a mosaic representing the Gothic ruler on horseback. This detail has understandably attracted attention, because if the Regisol were already standing nearby in Pavia, one might expect Agnellus to have mentioned it. The expectation becomes even stronger because Agnellus enjoyed drawing comparisons between different representations of Theodoric. When discussing Ravenna, he compared an image of the king on the facade of his palace, where Theodoric appeared with shield and lance, with the equestrian statue that once stood before the palace and displayed the ruler with the same military attributes. If Agnellus saw a mounted mosaic of Theodoric in Pavia and the Regisol was already there, why did he not compare those two monuments as well? Some scholars have treated this silence as evidence that the Regisol had not yet reached Pavia during Agnellus's lifetime. From this perspective, the statue must have been transferred sometime after the first decades of the 9th century. Yet silence in medieval sources must be handled cautiously. Cesare Saletti pointed out that Agnellus was not attempting to produce a complete guide to Ravenna's monuments. His work concerned the history of the Ravennate Church and the succession of its bishops. Objects without a direct connection to his ecclesiastical narrative could easily be ignored. That observation is certainly valid. Agnellus had no obligation to catalogue every important sculpture standing in Ravenna. His failure to mention the Regisole while describing the city therefore cannot prove by itself that the monument was absent. But the same logic can be turned around. If Agnellus was primarily interested in Ravenna rather than Pavia, his failure to mention the statue in Pavia would be even easier to understand. Pavia lay outside the main geographical and institutional focus of his history. This means that his silence cannot safely be used to prove that the Regisol had not yet arrived in Pavia. In fact, the argument may point slightly in the opposite direction. Agnellus says nothing about the monument even when discussing Ravenna, the city he knew intimately and described at great length. If the Regisol had still occupied a major public location near Ravenna's Forum during the early 9th century, its complete absence from his narrative is at least noteworthy. By contrast, if the statue had already been removed to Pavia, the silence becomes much easier to explain. Agnellus therefore cannot settle the question, but his testimony leaves open an important possibility. By the time he was writing in the 9th century, the Regisol may already have disappeared from Ravenna. If so, the search for the moment of its transfer must move backward rather than forward toward the political world of 8th century Italy and, potentially, toward the Langobard kings who ruled from Pavia. A firmer chronological limit for the presence of the Regisole in Pavia may come from a royal diploma issued by Berengar I sometime between 906 and 910. In describing the palace complex at Pavia, the document refers to a place under Theoderic within the principal portico or hall. The meaning of this phrase has been debated. Some scholars believe that it refers to the equestrian mosaic of Theodoric already described by Agnellus nearly a century earlier. Others distinguish the Lorbia, probably a large porticoed courtyard or ceremonial space, from the tribunal chamber mentioned by Agnellus, and argue that the diploma may instead refer to the Regisole itself. If that interpretation is correct, the statue was already standing in a major public space of the royal palace at Pavia by the beginning of the 10th century. The monument would therefore have been sufficiently famous to serve as a geographical reference point within the palace complex. An unexpected piece of evidence appears to strengthen this possibility. Several centuries later, the North African geographer Al-Himyar preserved information about Pavia that ultimately seems to derive from much earlier reports. Al-Himyar, who lived in Ceuta between the 13th and 14th centuries, relied on the writings of the Andalusian geographer Al-Udri. Al-Udri, in turn, appears to have drawn upon the travel account of Ibrahim ibn Yaqub al-Turtush, an Andalusian envoy who traveled through parts of Europe and visited the court of Otto I around the middle of the 10th century. The description of Pavia preserved in this geographical tradition is particularly striking. The city is said to possess a splendid palace, and at its entrance stood an enormous bronze statue of a mounted horseman. The description is brief, but it corresponds remarkably well with what is known about the Regisole. If the information ultimately goes back to the journey of Al-Zurtush, then the equestrian monument must already have been in Pavia by roughly the middle of the 10th century. In fact, the chronological range can be narrowed further. The description must belong to the period after the Frankish conquest of the Langobard kingdom in 774, but before the destruction of the royal palace in 1024. The likely date of the original observation, around the 960s, fits perfectly within those limits. This evidence establishes at least one important point. The Regisole did not arrive in Pavia during the later Middle Ages. It was already a prominent feature of the city centuries earlier. The Berengar diploma may even push its presence back to the opening years of the 10th century. The real question, then, is whether the monument had reached Pavia still earlier. A clue comes from a much later Pavia historian, Oppicinus de Canistris. Writing his Libellus de Descriptione Papiae around 1330, Oppicinus claimed that the Regisole had been brought to Pavia after an ancient war between Pavia and Ravenna. He added another remarkable detail. During the same conflict, the remains of the bishop Eleucadius were supposedly removed from Ravenna and transferred to Pavia. This tradition immediately suggests the great Langobard offensives against Ravenna during the 8th century. Ravenna, the capital of the Byzantine Exarchate in Italy, was attacked repeatedly by Langobard kings. King Liutprand occupied the city temporarily during the 730s, and in 751 King Aistulf finally conquered it. The connection becomes stronger when another source is considered. An anonymous text from approximately the middle of the 10th century explicitly credits Aistulf with transferring the body of Eleucadius to Pavia. The relics were deposited in the Basilica of San Michele, where the saint's remains continued to be venerated. If Oppicinus was correct that the Regisole and the relics traveled from Ravenna to Pavia during the same conflict, and if the 10th century tradition was correct that Aistulf removed the relics, the most natural conclusion is that Aistulf may also have ordered the transfer of the statue. There have been objections to this reconstruction. One argument focuses once again on Agnellus of Ravenna. His Liber Pontificalis does not mention the removal of Eleucadius's relics, leading some scholars to suggest that the saint's body must still have remained near Ravenna during the early 9th century. Yet this silence is hardly decisive. Agnellus certainly knew the traditional burial place of Eleucadius outside the walls of Classe, and he mentions the church associated with the saint, but he never explicitly states that the relics were still physically present there, in his own day. The continued existence of the church does not necessarily prove that the saint's remains had never been removed. A building could preserve the memory of a saint long after the body had been transferred elsewhere. Agnellus, therefore, does not directly contradict the tradition that Aistulf moved Eleucadius's relics to Pavia. His silence regarding the Regisol should be treated with similar caution. There is also a broader historical argument in favor of an 8th century transfer. The Langobard conquest of Ravenna in 751 is a clearly identifiable political event capable of explaining the removal of prestigious objects from the city. By contrast, theories placing the transfer in the 9th or 10th century usually struggle to identify an equally convincing historical occasion. The conquest under Aistulf therefore provides not only a possible date, but also a plausible motive. He was exactly the kind of ruler for whom the appropriation of a monumental equestrian image associated with Theodoric would have carried enormous political significance. Aistulf reigned only from 749 to 756, but those 7 years dramatically altered the balance of power in Italy. Under him, the old Langobard ambition of dominating the entire peninsula came closer to realization than at almost any previous moment. His own legislation reflects this expanding political vision. Earlier, Langobard rulers had styled themselves as kings of the Langobard people. Aistulf retained that identity, but added language claiming that the Roman population had been entrusted to him by God. This was more than an administrative formula. It amounted to an ideological declaration that his authority extended beyond the Langobards themselves. The implications were unmistakable. Aistulf was positioning himself as ruler of both Langobards and Romans, directly challenging the remaining authority of the Eastern Roman Empire in Italy. In doing so, he moved beyond the image of a purely ethnic king and toward a model of sovereignty resembling Roman imperial rule. Military success made those claims increasingly credible. Aistulf inflicted severe defeats upon Byzantine forces and progressively occupied territories that had long remained outside Langobard control. Comacchio and Ferrara fell under his authority, and eventually Ravenna itself was conquered. The capture of Ravenna was particularly important. For generations, the city had been both the practical headquarters and symbolic heart of Byzantine government in Italy. Seizing it, therefore, meant much more than gaining another urban center. Aistulf had taken possession of the principal seat from which Constantinople had exercised authority over central and northern Italy. His ambitions extended still further. He attempted to impose tribute directly upon the inhabitants of Rome, reportedly demanding a payment calculated at 1 solidus per person. Such a measure implied that he regarded the Roman population as subject to his fiscal authority. He also began issuing gold coinage at Ravenna bearing his own image. This was an exceptionally important act because gold coinage had traditionally carried strong associations with imperial sovereignty. By placing his portrait on such coins in a former imperial capital, Aistulf was participating in a visual language long monopolized by Roman emperors. His political program therefore appears to have been moving steadily toward a new conception of kingship. He was no longer presenting himself merely as the ruler of a Germanic people occupying part of Italy. He was developing the symbols and claims of a sovereign who intended to rule Italy itself. There are even indications that Aistulf considered Ravenna important enough to become a center of his government. Major construction activity seems to have accompanied Langobard control of the city. Among the projects connected with his reign was work on the building later known as Theodoric's Palace, or the Palace of the Exarchs, situated near what is now Via di Roma. Aistulf also appears to have sponsored the restoration of important religious monuments. One of these was the enormous Petriana church in Classe, which had been heavily damaged by an earthquake only a few years before the Langobard conquest. Reconstruction began, but seems never to have been completed. There may have been another, more ideologically significant intervention. The church, later known as Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, had originally been built by Theodoric as his Palatine church and dedicated to Christ the Savior. After Byzantine forces conquered Ravenna in 540, much of the visual memory of Theodoric's regime was deliberately altered. Images of the Gothic king and members of his court were removed or transformed. Yet, Agnellus reports that in his own time, an inscription commemorating Theodoric's foundation of the church could still be read in the apse. This is difficult to explain if Byzantine authorities had systematically attempted to erase the king's presence from the building. One possible solution lies in the earthquake that damaged several monuments of Ravenna during the 8th century. Agnellus states that the same seismic event that devastated the Petriana church also caused the apse of the former Theoderican Palatine church to collapse. If the original foundation inscription had been removed during the Byzantine period, it could have been restored when the damaged apse was reconstructed. Given the political chronology, Aistulf becomes an obvious candidate for sponsoring such work. If this reconstruction is correct, the restoration of Theodoric's name was hardly accidental. It would represent a conscious revival of the memory of the Ostrogothic king at precisely the moment when Aistulf himself was trying to extend Langobard authority over Roman Italy. The political usefulness of Theodoric becomes immediately apparent. Centuries earlier, Theodoric had successfully governed both Goths and Romans while exercising authority across much of Italy. Although he had never formally claimed the title of Roman emperor, his rule frequently adopted imperial language, imagery, and administrative traditions. Aistulf now found himself pursuing a similar ambition. His victories over the Byzantines had placed much of the peninsula within his reach, while his legal and fiscal claims increasingly presented him as ruler not only of the Langobards but of Roman populations as well. Theodoric could therefore serve as an extraordinarily powerful historical model. Aistulf could imagine himself as a successor to the Gothic king, another non-Roman ruler capable of governing Italy as a unified political space. This makes the possible transfer of the Regisol from Ravenna to Pavia especially significant. If the statue was already identified with Theodoric, moving it to the Langobard capital would have been a highly deliberate political gesture. Pavia had long been the central seat of Langobard royal authority. It also contained a palace associated with Theodoric himself. Installing the Regisol there would therefore unite several layers of political memory. A monument connected with the Gothic king would be removed from Ravenna, the former imperial and Ostrogothic capital, and placed in Pavia, the capital of the Langobard kingdom. The act would symbolically connect the two cities. Ravenna represented older imperial traditions and the memory of Theodoric's rule. Pavia represented the contemporary political power of the Langobards. By transferring the monument, Aistulf could visually announce that the political inheritance of Theodoric had passed into his own hands. This interpretation also helps explain why the image of Theodoric mattered so much. Aistulf's objective was not simply territorial expansion. His actions increasingly implied a claim to rule over the whole peninsula. The Regisol could transform that claim into monumental form. A mounted ruler dominating a public space in the royal palace was not merely decoration. Equestrian monuments had long communicated victory, authority, command, and imperial power. If contemporary viewers identified the horseman with Theodoric, then the political message would have been unmistakable. The old Gothic king had ruled Italy. Now his monumental image stood in the palace of the ruler who hoped to do the same. The consequences of this interpretation extend even into the reign of Charlemagne. Charlemagne's later removal of the other famous equestrian statue of Theodoric from Ravenna to Aachen has often puzzled historians. Theodoric was an Arian Christian whose religious reputation was deeply problematic in medieval Catholic tradition. Some accounts even imagined him condemned to eternal punishment. Why, then, would a ruler as closely associated with the Roman Church as Charlemagne deliberately display Theodoric's image at the heart of his own imperial center? If the Regisol had already been transferred to Pavia by Aistulf, the answer becomes more complicated and more interesting. Charlemagne's appropriation of Theodoric's Ravenna statue may have referred not only to the Gothic king himself, but also to the political geography of the kingdom Charlemagne had recently conquered. In 774, Charlemagne defeated the last Langobard king and assumed the title of King of the Langobards. The Langobard kingdom was incorporated into his expanding political system, but it did not simply disappear. It continued to exist as a recognizable kingdom within the larger Carolingian order. Pavia therefore remained an important center of royal legitimacy. If its palace already contained the Regisol, an equestrian monument understood as Theodoric, Charlemagne's decision to take another Theoderican statue from Ravenna to Aachen could establish an extraordinary symbolic connection among three centers of power. Ravenna represented the imperial and Ostrogothic past. Pavia represented the Langobard kingdom now absorbed by Charlemagne. Aachen represented the emerging Carolingian imperial order. Through the movement of monumental sculpture, those political landscapes could be linked together. Theodoric's image became a transferable symbol capable of connecting successive rulers who claimed authority over Italy and, increasingly, over a renewed Western Empire. The appropriation of famous ancient sculptures also served another purpose. Medieval rulers understood that monumental objects could communicate international prestige. A court capable of displaying extraordinary bronze statues from the Roman past presented itself as an heir to imperial civilization. This was particularly important for newly developing political centers such as Aachen. Unlike Rome, Constantinople, or Ravenna, Aachen did not possess centuries of monumental imperial architecture. Its rulers therefore had to construct their own landscape of legitimacy. Imported ancient works could help accomplish this. Columns, marbles, bronzes, and other prestigious objects taken from older Mediterranean centers allowed the Carolingian capital to participate visually in the heritage of Rome. They created what might be called a topography of power, in which political authority was expressed not only through titles and ceremonies, but through the physical environment surrounding the ruler. Charlemagne's acquisition of Theodoric's equestrian statue can therefore be understood within this broader strategy. The object was valuable because it was ancient, monumental, technologically impressive, and connected with the imperial history of Italy. Yet the association with Theodoric probably remained central. Whatever later ecclesiastical tradition said about his religious errors, the Gothic king's political reputation survived with remarkable strength north of the Alps. In heroic tradition, royal memory, and monumental culture, he remained one of the most famous rulers of the post-Roman West. For Aistulf, that reputation may have been even more useful. His political ambitions were focused directly on Italy. He had conquered Ravenna, challenged Byzantine authority, attempted to impose his power over Rome, and increasingly presented himself as ruler of both Langobards and Romans. Theodoric offered the perfect precedent for such claims. He too had been a non-Roman king who conquered Italy, established his authority in Ravenna, governed Roman populations, and adopted the political language of imperial rule. If Aistulf restored Theodoric's memory in Ravenna and transferred the Regia Sol to Pavia, these actions formed part of the same ideological program. They transformed the Gothic king into a historical predecessor whose prestige could legitimize Langobard expansion. The Regia Sol would then have been much more than an ancient bronze sculpture surviving from Roman antiquity. Its meaning had evolved through centuries of reinterpretation. It may originally have represented a Roman emperor, perhaps Marcus Aurelius. Under Theodoric, it may have been moved and adapted as part of Ravenna's claim to imperial status. Over time, the rider himself came to be identified with Theodoric. Under Aistulf, that transformed image could be appropriated once again. Removed from Ravenna and installed at Pavia, it became a monument to the political ambitions of a Langobard king who sought to reunite Italy under his authority. Charlemagne would later repeat the gesture in a different context when he transported the other Theoderican equestrian statue to Aachen. Each transfer altered the monument's political meaning while preserving the extraordinary prestige attached to the figure of the Gothic ruler. The history of these statues therefore reveals something larger about medieval political culture. Rulers did not rely only on written genealogies, legal titles, or military victories to establish legitimacy. They also appropriated landscapes, buildings, relics, inscriptions, and ancient works of art. Objects could become arguments. A bronze horseman could proclaim continuity with Rome, possession of a conquered capital, succession to an admired ruler, or ambition to govern an entire peninsula. The statue did not need to have originally represented Theodoric for its later audiences to experience it as his image. What mattered politically was not only the monument's ancient identity, but the meanings generations of rulers and viewers attach to it. In the case of Aistulf, the symbolism would have been particularly powerful. As his armies expanded Langobard control and his political language increasingly approached imperial claims, Theodoric provided a model of successful rule over both Roman and non-Roman populations. For a brief moment, Aistulf seemed capable of realizing the same vision on an even broader scale. The conquest of Ravenna appeared to open the way toward a unified Italy under Langobard sovereignty. The Regisol, standing in Pavia within a palace already connected with Theodoric, could embody that ambition in monumental form. But the moment did not last. A new power was emerging beyond the Alps. Frankish intervention would ultimately destroy Aistulf's hopes of dominating the peninsula, and within a generation the Langobard kingdom itself would fall to Charlemagne. Even so, the symbolic strategies developed during Aistulf's reign did not disappear. They were inherited, transformed, and reused by his conquerors. The monumental memory of Theodoric passed from Ostrogothic Ravenna to Langobard Pavia and Carolingian Aachen, continually adapted to new political circumstances. The Regisol thus belonged to a much larger story about the survival and reinvention of imperial imagery after Rome. Its rider may have begun as a Roman emperor, but later generations transformed him into Theodoric, and through Theodoric, into a symbol of legitimate authority over Italy. For Aistulf in particular, that symbolism offered an exceptional political language. By invoking the memory of the Gothic king, he could present his own victories not merely as Langobard expansion, but as the restoration of a broader Italian sovereignty. For a period in the middle of the 8th century, the dream seemed remarkably close to reality. It was only the rise of Carolingian power that ultimately brought that project to an end. The collection presents Greek and Roman sculpture not simply as a series of representations of gods and heroes, but as a remarkably diverse visual world filled with religion, mythology, emotion, everyday life, and human experience. Figures such as Fortuna, Apollo, Hermes, Aphrodite, Pan, Dionysus, Heracles, Artemis, and Hypnos appear in very different forms, revealing how ancient artists could transform familiar divine identities according to setting, purpose, and artistic tradition. Fortuna, for example, is defined through the rudder, globe, and cornucopia, symbols that connect her with destiny, control, prosperity, and the unpredictable course of human life. Apollo appears in a ceremonial musical setting as leader of the Muses, while Hermes combines the familiar attributes of the divine messenger with an unexpectedly melancholy expression. Many of the sculptures also demonstrate how Greek artistic traditions continue to influence Roman visual culture. Roman sculptors repeatedly copied, adapted, and reinterpreted earlier Greek models, sometimes deliberately preserving archaic features because older artistic forms carried religious authority. Certain statues, therefore, cannot be understood simply as Roman inventions or straightforward copies. They belong to a long process in which ancient types were continuously modified. Hermes, Aphrodite, Pan, and other figures survive in multiple versions, suggesting that celebrated originals inspired generations of later artists. The Dionysian world occupies an especially important place in the collection. Satyrs, Maenads, Pan, Silenus, Dionysos, and other figures create an atmosphere dominated by wine, music, dancing, desire, transformation, and ecstatic religion. One elaborate relief represents Dionysos visiting Icarius, the mortal traditionally associated with receiving the knowledge of winemaking. The scene combines mythology with the details of elite domestic life. Couches, food, architecture, ritual objects, musical instruments, garlands, theatrical masks, and sacred imagery all appear together. Rather than presenting mythology in isolation, the relief places divine experience within a recognizable social environment. Other Dionysian works emphasize movement and emotional intensity. Maenads dance while satyrs play musical instruments, panthers accompany the procession, and Dionysian followers appear caught in states of excitement and abandon. Pan himself changes dramatically from one sculpture to another. In some works, he is grotesque and strongly animal-like, with horns, pointed ears, and goat features. Elsewhere, he appears almost completely human, resembling a beautiful young athlete. These differences show that ancient divine identities were flexible rather than fixed, allowing artists to emphasize savagery, humor, sensuality, youth, or beauty, depending on the composition. Metamorphosis also becomes an important theme. A striking group shows a woman gradually becoming a vine beside Dionysos. Her lower body merges with vegetation while grapes and leaves spread across her form. Although she was once identified differently, the figure is more convincingly interpreted as ambrosia. The composition turns transformation into an expression of Dionysian fertility and abundance. Human beings, plants, wine, gods, and animals become part of the same interconnected world. Yet the collection is not limited to divine or heroic subjects. One of its most memorable sculptures depicts two children fighting over a game of knucklebones. One boy bites the arm of another, while the gaming pieces remain scattered nearby. The scene is remarkable precisely because nothing heroic is happening. It captures an ordinary childhood quarrel with extraordinary physical and emotional intensity. Such works reflect the growing interest of Hellenistic artists in everyday subjects, including children, workers, elderly people, foreigners, strong emotions, and moments that earlier monumental art might have ignored. Other sculptures explore quieter experiences. Hypnos, the god of sleep, appears as a winged infant resting beside an amphora while holding poppies. The sculpture originally functioned as part of a fountain, allowing flowing water to reinforce the peaceful atmosphere of sleep. Aphrodite appears repeatedly in intimate moments connected with bathing, dressing, or adjusting her clothing. Heracles is represented both as an aged, experienced hero and as an idealized young athlete. Through these contrasts, the collection moves easily between violence and tranquility, youth and age, divine power and ordinary vulnerability. The surviving works also reveal how difficult it can be to determine the original identity of ancient sculptures. Missing attributes, damaged bodies, later additions, and similarities between mythological figures often make identification uncertain. A seated woman, once interpreted as a companion of Artemis, may actually have represented a girl playing knucklebones. A mysterious flute player has been called Pan, Hyagnis, and Midas. Other fragmentary figures have been associated with Ariadne, Attis, nymphs, and various divine personalities without absolute certainty. Ancient sculpture therefore often survives as a puzzle rather than a complete visual statement. Modern restoration has made this problem even more complicated. During the Renaissance and later centuries, collectors frequently wanted ancient statues to appear complete. Missing arms, legs, heads, weapons, clothing, and attributes were reconstructed, but restorers sometimes misunderstood the surviving evidence. In one striking example, fingers belonging to a nymph resisting a satyr were mistakenly incorporated into the reconstructed body of the satyr himself. Elsewhere, restored grapes, drinking vessels, bows, or other objects may have changed the meaning of the original compositions. Restoration could therefore preserve an ancient object physically while simultaneously altering its story. For this reason, damaged and incomplete areas can sometimes provide more reliable information than reconstructed ones. Empty eye sockets reveal that colored materials were once inserted to create realistic eyes. Small holes show where metal ornaments were attached. Unfinished backs indicate that statues were designed to stand against walls or inside niches. Traces of supports reveal how figures were positioned, while damaged bases can preserve evidence of later copying practices. What initially appears to be simple damage can therefore become valuable archaeological evidence. The sculptures must also be imagined very differently from the white marble objects seen in modern museums. Ancient sculpture originally existed within environments filled with color, architecture, gardens, water, music, ritual activity, incense, festivals, and human movement. Metal accessories, painted surfaces, inserted eyes, jewelry, fountains, and surrounding decoration contributed to the experience of these works. A sleeping hypnos beside running water would have produced a completely different impression from the same sculpture displayed silently under museum lighting. A Dionysian procession placed near a dining area could connect myth directly with drinking, celebration, and social life. Location was therefore essential to meaning. Some sculptures stood in temples and sanctuaries, others in imperial villas, gardens, bath complexes, fountains, dining spaces, or private residences. Religious images could acquire enormous power from their surroundings, while decorative mythological works interacted with the activities taking place around them. Removing sculptures from these environments and placing them in museums preserves the objects, but inevitably separates them from much of their original sensory and cultural context. The history of these sculptures did not end in antiquity. Many were buried, rediscovered, restored, collected, transported, copied, and repeatedly reinterpreted. Some passed through Renaissance palaces and aristocratic collections before entering modern museums. Others were excavated at places such as Ostia, Cumae, Antium, Gabii, Tarsus, and the region around Lake Nemi. During this long history, identities were sometimes changed and new interpretations attached to ancient fragments. A figure could be called Pan in one generation and Midas in another, while an anonymous woman might become a nymph or Ariadne depending on how scholars understood her attributes. Taken together, the collection demonstrates the extraordinary range of Greek and Roman visual storytelling. Ancient sculpture could represent divine ritual, drunken celebration, erotic conflict, childhood aggression, athletic strength, peaceful sleep, music, transformation, humor, fear, and death. Marble was capable of communicating far more than idealized beauty. Artists used the human and divine body to explore almost every imaginable emotional state, from the wild excitement of Dionysian worship to the quiet stillness of a sleeping child. What survives today is therefore only a fragment of a much richer ancient experience. The missing colors, metal attachments, architectural settings, flowing water, ritual performances, and surrounding sounds must be reconstructed through archaeological evidence and careful interpretation. At the same time, scholars must distinguish ancient material from later restoration and remain cautious when assigning identities to incomplete figures. The collection ultimately reveals not only what Greek and Roman artists created, but also how their works were displayed, damaged, rediscovered, transformed, and understood across centuries. Despite everything that has been lost, the emotions captured in these sculptures, the laughter of satyrs, the violence of quarreling children, the melancholy of Hermes, the frenzy of Maenads, and the peaceful sleep of Hypnos, continue to preserve something of the extraordinary imaginative world of antiquity. The discussion begins with the political crisis surrounding Theodulf of Orléans and the punishment of those implicated in rebellion against Louis the Pious. The Chronicle of Moissac repeatedly uses the expression malignum concilium, or evil counsel, when describing the affair. A textual problem involving the word predicti creates uncertainty about exactly whom the chronicler considered responsible, but one possible reading suggests that Theodulf was regarded as an important source of the harmful advice connected with the conspirators, and that ecclesiastics associated with this council were consequently removed from office. The precise nature of Theodulf's alleged involvement remains uncertain. One possibility is that the evil council concerned discussions over how captured conspirators should be punished. Other contemporary voices, including Fulda, had advocated mercy. As a senior churchman, Theodulf may have participated in Louis the Pious's deliberations. He could have offered advice that was subsequently misunderstood, or political enemies may have attributed to him a recommendation he never actually made. Either scenario could have allowed Theodulf to be portrayed as partly responsible for the disastrous fate of Bernard. Theodulf's earlier career makes the issue particularly complicated. He had served as a missus Dominicus and therefore understood judicial procedures, ambiguous oaths, and legal strategies. At the same time, his writings reveal discomfort with severe corporal punishment and concern about actions that might indirectly cause another person's death. He preferred comparatively merciful punishment and presented the compassionate judge in strongly positive terms. This raises the possibility that he may have supported blinding, precisely because it appeared less severe than execution, although it is equally possible that enemies falsely represented him as advocating such a punishment. The surviving evidence does not permit a definitive answer. Louis's demand that Theodulf make a confessio may therefore have had political as well as religious and judicial significance. Louis apparently offered the possibility of amnesty, if Theodulf publicly confessed. The emperor may have wanted the archbishop to accept some responsibility for Bernard's fate, thereby sharing the moral burden created by the punishment. Contemporary accounts indicate that Louis himself was troubled by the mutilation carried out against the conspirators and later acknowledged his failure to prevent his advisors from implementing it. Such a confession could have served several purposes. It might have helped Louis demonstrate that responsibility for the crisis was being acknowledged before eventually restoring Theodulf to office. Alternatively, the demand may have been deliberately humiliating, making restoration politically or personally impossible. Public confession in Carolingian political culture could therefore function simultaneously as religious penance, political theatre, and an instrument for redistributing responsibility. Bernard's fate ultimately damaged Louis the Pious's reputation in much the same way that the executions of Boethius and Symmachus had damaged the memory of the Ostrogothic king Theoderic. Medieval political memory did not easily separate punishment from the ruler who authorized or failed to prevent it. Visions of the afterlife could even transform controversial political events into divine judgments. Bernard's punishment came to be regarded as a moral crime demanding penance, contributing to Louis's famous public act of penance at Attigny in 822. The comparison with Theodoric is especially significant because later tradition portrayed him as suffering punishment in the afterlife for the deaths associated with his reign. Stories involving Boethius, Symmachus, and Pope John contributed to an increasingly negative moral interpretation of Theodoric's final years. The discussion therefore emphasizes a broader medieval principle. Rulers and judges could continue to be judged long after political crises ended, not only by historians but through religious narratives concerning guilt, punishment, and salvation. The text then turns directly to the transmission of traditions concerning Boethius. A particular vita edited by Fabio Troncarelli differs substantially from the better-known lives and has been connected with a hypothetical ancient edition associated with Cassiodorus. Although certain early manuscripts preserve elements that might support such a tradition, the evidence remains highly fragmented. Much of the material derives from identifiable sources such as the Ordo Generis and the Liber Pontificalis. For this reason, the proposed Cassiodorian archetype should be treated cautiously. The medieval evidence appears less like fragments of a single coherent ancient biography and more like material assembled from several independent traditions. Information survives in marginal notes, commentaries, additions, and disconnected pieces. The resulting text may therefore represent a medieval composite rather than the broken remains of an originally unified Cassiodorian work. The discussion subsequently moves from Boethius to Cassiodorus himself, and particularly to the medieval reception of his Variae. Cassiodorus's letters are among the most important sources for 6th century Italy and later became influential models for letter writing. Their transmission during the early Middle Ages, however, remains difficult to reconstruct. The collection appears in 9th century catalogues from Lorsch, while quotations and fragments become more visible from the late 10th and 11th centuries onward before fuller evidence reappears during the 12th century. Traditional scholarship has often searched for explicit references to Cassiodorus or lengthy direct quotations from the Variae. A different approach examines individual words, formulas, and stylistic expressions characteristic of Cassiodorus. Modern textual databases make it possible to trace these linguistic patterns across large collections of Latin literature. By studying such expressions in context, scholars can investigate whether Cassiodorus's diplomatic language circulated more widely in 9th century Europe than the surviving manuscripts alone would suggest. This approach becomes especially important when examining Charlemagne's diplomatic correspondence with Constantinople. Diplomatic letters were fundamental instruments of communication between ancient and medieval rulers, often accompanying embassies and oral messages. Most disappeared because secular archives were lost, and individual diplomatic documents often ceased to have practical value once negotiations ended. Consequently, only a tiny fraction of Charlemagne's foreign correspondence survives. Only 4 diplomatic letters from Charlemagne remain, 2 addressed to Offa of Mercia and 2 to Byzantine emperors, Nicephorus I and Michael I. This small surviving group is misleading because Charlemagne maintained extensive relations with Byzantium, particularly after the Carolingian conquest of the Lombard kingdom and the expansion of Frankish influence in Italy. Relations became even more sensitive after Charlemagne's imperial coronation in 800 because the legitimacy and meaning of his new imperial title had to be negotiated against Byzantine claims to Roman imperial authority. This new political situation required a new diplomatic language. Earlier, Frankish rulers had often addressed Byzantine emperors using terms such as dominus or pater, which could imply hierarchy or subordination. Charlemagne needed formulas capable of presenting himself as an imperial equal. Late antique diplomatic traditions offered useful models, and evidence suggests that the Carolingian chancery may have drawn upon 6th century language preserved in works such as Cassiodorus's Variae. The letter sent to Emperor Nicephorus I in 811 provides important evidence. Charlemagne discusses the arrival of the Byzantine envoy Arsacius, who had originally been sent to his son Pippin. Pippin's death in 810 prevented the intended negotiations from proceeding. The diplomatic situation was connected with Carolingian activity in Veneto and the Venetian Lagoon, territories still formally associated with Byzantine authority. Charlemagne used the opportunity to reopen negotiations with Constantinople after years of tension, seeking peace and, crucially, recognition of his imperial status. One of the most revealing features of the letter is Charlemagne's use of fraternitas when addressing the Byzantine emperor. This vocabulary of brotherhood was unusual in earlier Frankish diplomatic correspondence with Constantinople. By describing the Byzantine ruler in terms of fraternity rather than paternal authority, Charlemagne could present the two emperors as political equals rather than placing himself in a subordinate relationship. Cassiodorus provides significant precedence for precisely this usage. In the Variae, fraternitas appears in diplomatic letters written on behalf of Theodoric to foreign kings. In those contexts, the term could create a language of equality between sovereigns, whether as a diplomatic courtesy or as an implicit political claim. Charlemagne's adoption of similar vocabulary may therefore have served the same purpose, asserting parity with the Byzantine emperor while maintaining a courteous diplomatic tone. The similarity does not necessarily mean that Charlemagne personally copied Cassiodorus. The actual writers working within the Carolingian chancery may have consulted older collections while searching for appropriate diplomatic formulas. Figures such as Alcuin could also adapt terminology traditionally used in ecclesiastical correspondence. Nevertheless, Cassiodorus offered precisely the kind of late antique diplomatic vocabulary required by a ruler whose imperial position was still being negotiated. Further linguistic parallels strengthen the possibility of Cassiodorian influence. The letter to Nicephorus uses formulas concerning the sending of legati that closely resemble expressions appearing in diplomatic letters within the Variae. Individual words such as legati or dirigere were not unique to Cassiodorus, but particular combinations of vocabulary, grammatical construction, and diplomatic context are much rarer. Before 900, some of these formulations appear in diplomatic correspondence, primarily in Cassiodorus and Charlemagne's letter to Nicephorus. These similarities become significant when considered together rather than individually. A single shared word could easily be accidental, but a cluster of unusual expressions used in comparable diplomatic situations suggests that Carolingian writers may have known or indirectly inherited Cassiodorian models. The Variae may therefore have circulated intellectually even during periods when surviving manuscript evidence for the collection is scarce. The letter to Michael I from 813 continues this diplomatic process. Its central objective was peace between the Carolingian and Byzantine empires, together with concord between their churches. Charlemagne sent Amalarius and Peter of Nonantola to Constantinople to complete negotiations. A formal agreement had apparently already been drafted, sent westward, accepted by Charlemagne, and returned to Constantinople so that the Byzantine emperor could also confirm it. The surviving correspondence therefore illuminates more than relations between Charlemagne and Byzantium. It reveals how the Carolingian court searched the late antique past for political and linguistic models appropriate to its new imperial position. After 800, Charlemagne could no longer rely entirely upon the diplomatic conventions used by earlier Frankish kings. Claiming imperial equality required a language capable of communicating that equality, and the diplomatic world preserved by Cassiodorus offered precisely such a vocabulary. More broadly, the evidence demonstrates that textual influence does not always depend upon extensive quotation or explicit acknowledgement. An author may survive through formulas, individual expressions, administrative vocabulary, and stylistic habits. The apparent disappearance of Cassiodorus's Variae from much of the early medieval manuscript record therefore does not necessarily mean that the work had ceased to influence political writing. Taken together, these discussions reveal the importance of language, memory, and textual transmission in early medieval political culture. Theodulf's case demonstrates how words such as malignum concilium and confessio could shape interpretations of political guilt and responsibility. The traditions surrounding Boethius and Theodoric show how controversial punishments could transform the posthumous reputation of rulers. Finally, the possible influence of Cassiodorus on Carolingian diplomacy illustrates how political language from late antiquity could be revived centuries later to address entirely new problems. Across these examples, the past remained politically active. Earlier texts provided models for diplomacy. Earlier political tragedies offered warnings about guilt and punishment, and inherited literary traditions influenced how rulers were remembered. Carolingian political culture was therefore not created in isolation. It continually interacted with Roman and post-Roman traditions, adapting older concepts of authority, justice, confession, diplomatic equality, and imperial legitimacy to the changing political world of the 9th century. A close comparison between Charlemagne's diplomatic correspondence and Cassiodorus's Variae suggests that Carolingian writers may have deliberately borrowed late antique political vocabulary when defining relations with Byzantium. One of the clearest examples appears in Charlemagne's letter to Michael I, where peace is described as something sought rather than requested. This recalls the opening of Variae 1:1, in which Theodoric addresses Emperor Anastasius and speaks of seeking peace. The wording is important because more conventional Latin expressions for asking peace could imply submission, whereas pacem quaerere allowed a ruler to express respect without presenting himself as inferior. The political situations of Theodoric and Charlemagne were different, but both faced a similar diplomatic problem. Theodoric wanted to maintain formal respect toward Constantinople while defending Gothic independence and his own quasi-imperial authority. Charlemagne likewise needed Byzantine recognition of his imperial dignity without appearing subordinate to the Eastern emperor. Cassiodorus's diplomatic language therefore offered an especially useful precedent because it had already been designed to balance deference with political equality. Other phrases in Charlemagne's letters reinforce this possibility. Expressions concerning the dispatch of present envoys resemble formulations found in the Variae. None of these parallels alone proves direct dependence, but the accumulation of unusual lexical and stylistic similarities makes coincidence less likely. The most plausible explanation is that the Carolingian chancery either had access to Cassiodorus's letters themselves or to diplomatic formulas derived from them. The letter to Michael I also uses the expressions Eastern Empire and Western Empire. These terms were relatively uncommon and belonged especially to the political vocabulary of late antiquity. They had been used by authors such as Orosius, Marcellinus Comes, and Cassiodorus, as well as in works connected with Cassiodorus's intellectual circle. Their reappearance in Carolingian diplomatic language may therefore reflect a conscious attempt to recover a late antique model in which Eastern and Western imperial structures could coexist. This terminology carried considerable ideological weight. Byzantium traditionally emphasized the unity and indivisibility of Roman imperial authority and was reluctant to recognize another emperor in the West. Charlemagne and his advisors needed historical and linguistic precedents, showing that two imperial spheres could exist simultaneously. 5th and 6th century texts provided exactly such examples. The Variae, written under Theoderic, were particularly useful because they emerged from a court that also had to negotiate its status in relation to Constantinople. Earlier, Merovingian diplomatic traditions were less suitable for Charlemagne's needs. The Carolingians had a politically complicated relationship with the dynasty they had replaced, and Merovingian kings had generally addressed Byzantine rulers from a more subordinate position. Charlemagne's imperial ambitions required a different language. Late antique texts allowed his court to construct an image of political equivalence rather than dependence. This renewed interest in Theodoric may also help explain the Carolingian fascination with the Ostrogothic ruler. The transfer of an equestrian statue associated with Theodoric to Aachen and later literary works concerning him suggest that his reign remained meaningful within Carolingian political culture. Theodoric could function as a historical example of a Western ruler who governed independently while maintaining a complex relationship with Constantinople. Evidence for the 9th century circulation of Cassiodorus is not limited to diplomatic letters. The writings of Paschasius Radbertus contain several exceptionally rare expressions that closely resemble language in the Variae. The most striking example is the verb penesco, which appears in both authors and is almost unattested elsewhere before the later Middle Ages. Cassiodorus uses penesco metaphorically when describing a young Goth reaching adulthood, comparing him to a young eagle acquiring mature feathers and becoming capable of independent flight. Paschasius employs the same unusual verb in an allegorical context involving wings and flight. Because a much more common synonym was readily available, the choice of such a rare word strongly suggests literary borrowing or at least indirect familiarity with Cassiodorus. Another parallel appears in Paschasius's Expositio in Matteo, where the phrase injusta praesumptio occurs. This combination is otherwise found in the Variae. Taken together with the use of penesco, the evidence makes it likely that Paschasius knew at least part of Cassiodorus's correspondence or had access to a collection preserving Cassiodorian language. The possible influence of Cassiodorus becomes even more important when considering the donation of Constantine, or Constitutum Constantini. The origins and authorship of this famous medieval forgery remain debated, but some scholars have connected its final form with the monastery of Corbie and the intellectual environment surrounding Paschasius, Radbertus, Wala, and Hilduin of Saint-Denis. One particularly significant expression in the donation is ad imitationem imperii nostri. This formulation closely resembles Theodoric's statement in Variae 1, one that his kingdom was an imitation or reflection of the Roman imperial model. The conceptual similarity is striking because both passages use the language of imperial imitation in unusually explicit terms. Additional parallels strengthen the case. The donation contains a formula involving a violator or despiser of its provisions that closely resembles language found in two Cassiodorian letters. Other expressions, including references to the Most Distinguished Senate and Our Serenity, also belong to late antique political vocabulary familiar from the Variae. Individually, these similarities might be dismissed, but collectively, they make knowledge of Cassiodorus increasingly plausible. The ideological context is equally important. If the final form of the donation of Constantine was produced or revised in the Carolingian world, Cassiodorus offered useful linguistic material for a document concerned with imperial legitimacy and the relationship between Rome and Constantinople. The forged donation retrospectively weakened Byzantine claims to exclusive imperial authority by presenting Constantine as transferring extraordinary privileges and symbols of power to the Roman Church. The same Cassiodorian letter that may have influenced Charlemagne's diplomatic correspondence could therefore have been reused a generation later in a very different political project. In Charlemagne's letters, late antique language helped establish equality between Western and Eastern emperors. In the donation of Constantine, similar traditions could support a much more radical argument about the distribution of imperial authority. The overall evidence suggests that the variae circulated in 9th century intellectual culture more widely than the surviving manuscript record might initially indicate. Cassiodorus appears indirectly in diplomatic correspondence, theological and exegetical writing, and possibly one of the most influential political forgeries of the Middle Ages. It remains possible that some expressions reached Carolingian writers through chancery formularies rather than through direct reading of Cassiodorus. Yet, this explanation is not entirely satisfactory. If a standardized diplomatic formula collection were responsible, one might expect longer and more consistent borrowings. Instead, the parallels appear scattered across different letters and works, including obscure vocabulary taken from relatively unimportant passages of the variae. This pattern suggests a more flexible form of literary engagement. Carolingian intellectuals may have possessed either complete copies of the variae or substantial selections from them, and consulted Cassiodorus for different purposes. Diplomatic writers appreciated his political vocabulary, while Paschasius appears to have treated him almost as a classical stylist whose unusual words and elegant expressions could enrich contemporary Latin. The author of Charlemagne's Byzantine correspondence seems to have understood not merely isolated phrases, but also the ideological context of Variae 1:1. The parallel between Theodoric's relationship with Constantinople and Charlemagne's own diplomatic position would have been meaningful only to someone with at least some awareness of 6th century political history. The same may be true of the writer or reviser of the donation of Constantine. Paschasius's use of Cassiodorus appears somewhat different. Rather than primarily borrowing political concepts, he seems interested in distinctive vocabulary and stylistic refinement. Cassiodorus could therefore function simultaneously as a historical authority, a diplomatic model, and a source of elegant Latin expression. It is impossible to determine whether 9th century writers had access to all 12 books of the variae or only to a substantial selection of letters. Nevertheless, the diversity of the parallels suggests familiarity with more than a single famous epistle. The evidence points toward a broader circulation and reception of Cassiodorus than direct manuscript survival alone would suggest. Taken together, these examples reveal how deeply Carolingian intellectual culture engaged with late antiquity. Charlemagne's court did not simply revive Roman terminology for decorative purposes. Older texts were searched for solutions to contemporary political problems, particularly the difficult question of how a Western emperor could define himself in relation to Byzantium. Cassiodorus was especially useful because his works had already confronted similar questions of authority, legitimacy, political hierarchy, and relations between Western rulers and Constantinople. 3 centuries later, Carolingian scholars could adapt that language to a radically different political world while preserving many of its original ideological implications. The survival of the variae in the 9th century should therefore be understood not merely as a question of manuscript transmission. Their influence can also be traced through vocabulary, rhetorical formulas, political concepts, and intertextual echoes. Even when Cassiodorus is not named, his language appears to have remained available to scholars and officials who found in his writings both stylistic sophistication and a valuable vocabulary for discussing empire. Ultimately, the evidence suggests that Cassiodorus occupied a significant, if often hidden, place in Carolingian intellectual culture. His diplomatic language helped provide models for Charlemagne's negotiations with Byzantium. His unusual vocabulary influenced Paschasius Radbertus, and his conception of imperial imitation may have contributed to the language of the donation of Constantine. These scattered traces together reveal a much richer history of the reception of the variae during the early Middle Ages than the surviving manuscript evidence alone would indicate. This study examines the circulation and reuse of Cassiodorus's variae before the great expansion of surviving manuscripts from the 12th to the 14th centuries. Earlier scholarship has focused mainly on the later medieval period, when the collection became widely used by European chanceries. The author approaches the problem by working backward from 14th century Rome, where the variae clearly influenced the correspondence of the Roman commune, and then tracing earlier examples into the 12th, 11th, and finally, the years around 1000. The investigation focuses particularly on Lazio between roughly 997 and 1027, where the earliest known documentary reuses of the Variae appear to cluster. Searches in other areas, including Ravenna, have so far produced no comparable evidence for the same period. This concentration in Lazio is especially interesting because the political, legal, and documentary culture of Rome and its surrounding region around the year 1000 still preserved certain features inherited from the Carolingian world. The evidence is organized around 10 documents dating from 997 to 1027. They survive through 4 principal archival traditions: the cartularies of Fafa, Subiaco, and Tivoli, and the archives of St. Peter's in Rome. The first 3 transmit copies of earlier charters preserved because ecclesiastical institutions needed reliable records for managing property and defending legal rights. The documents from St. Peter's, by contrast, survive in their original form. 9 of the 10 documents are donations, frequently involving churches, estates, and landed property transferred by members of the upper or middle social ranks to monasteries or episcopal institutions. The remaining document is a notitia placiti, the written record of a judicial assembly. These documents belong to the practical world of property, law, and institutional administration rather than purely literary culture. The writers responsible for these texts were all professional notaries. Stephanus of Tivoli used the late antique title tabellio and even described himself on one occasion as dativus iudex. The Roman writers called themselves scriniari or scriniari et tabelliones. The reuse of Cassiodorus therefore occurred within a professional community of legal and documentary specialists who were producing documents intended to possess lasting juridical force. Cassiodorian language appears primarily in the arenga, the introductory section of a charter that explains and morally or legally justifies the transaction. These prologues combined religious, ethical, legal, and institutional ideas. Because arengae could circulate independently as reusable microtexts, a striking phrase or formula could pass between notaries without requiring the entire document from which it originated to circulate alongside it. The most common Cassiodorian reuse combines material from Variae 11, 2, and 8, 29. It appears in 7 of the 10 documents and was used by 3 different notaries. The first original letter concerned Cassiodorus's appointment as Praetorian Prefect and expressed the idea that personal success and office ultimately derived from divine favor. The second concerned the restoration of Parma's sewer system and argued that holders of public responsibility should work for the collective good. The notaries of Lazio creatively combined these 2 originally different contexts. They transformed Cassiodorus's language of divine favor and public duty into a justification for religious donations. Property ultimately came from God, and therefore its owners had an obligation to give part of it to institutions whose members prayed to God. Biblical quotations were added to reinforce the argument. The result was not simple copying, but substantial adaptation. This transformation also reflects wider social change. In Cassiodorus's 6th century context, the language of collective responsibility concerned the functioning of the city and its public institutions. Around the year 1000, the same conceptual vocabulary was redirected toward monasteries. These institutions had become major centers of landed wealth, social organization, and economic exchange, distributing estates through temporary concessions and creating extensive networks of dependency and cooperation. Another Cassiodorian arenga appears in testamentary donations. Its model comes from Variae 4:4, a letter in which Theodoric informed the Roman Senate of the appointment of a new official and praised the principle of granting honors to deserving men. A Roman notary named Petrus adapted this language to justify the distribution of property at death. Here again, the political meaning of the original text was redirected toward Christian charity. Cassiodorus's idea that benefits granted to worthy individuals contributed to the common good became an argument that property should be transferred generously to religious recipients. The adapted arenga added biblical quotations about giving, good works, divine reward, and responsible stewardship, including a passage attributed to Jerome concerning the good administrator who reserves nothing for himself. A third important reuse appears in a judicial document from 1012 concerning a dispute between a family and the Abbey of Farfa over a house near Piazza Navona and lands in southern Sabina. The family produced lease documents in its defense, but Roman officials and papal judges declared them forged and returned the disputed property to Farfa. Although the proceedings were presented as legally fair, the abbey's superior resources and cultural position may have given it a considerable advantage. The opening formula of this judicial record derives from Variae 9:4. In the original letter, King Athalaric allowed certain individuals to escape legal obligations attached to the status of curiales. Cassiodorus justified this exception by presenting princely mercy as capable of overcoming the strictness of law. The letter was therefore essentially an example of a successful appeal in which royal pietas softened normal legal requirements. That model was highly suitable for a judicial record intended to present a difficult conflict as having reached a legitimate and even conciliatory conclusion. The notary, Leo, could use Cassiodorus's language to emphasize the relationship between law, mercy, judgment, and legitimate authority. The parallel presence of officials described as prefects in both the ancient and medieval contexts may also have encouraged the choice of this particular Cassiodorian passage. These examples demonstrate that the Variae were not copied mechanically. Medieval notaries selected phrases from documents originally concerned with public administration, royal appointments, civic responsibility, and legal exceptions, then reshaped them for donations, wills, monastic property transactions, and lawsuits. Cassiodorus became a reservoir of prestigious language that could be detached from its 6th century setting and made useful for entirely different institutions. The manuscript tradition may provide clues to how such material reached Lazio. One potentially significant manuscript is Montpellier H294, produced in a Cistercian environment in the late 12th century and later preserved at Clairvaux. It contains the Variae alongside theological, hagiographical, and scholarly works. Because another text in the manuscript was written by Nicola Maniacutia, a Roman intellectual, active principally in Rome and Lazio, it is possible that the Cistercian compilers had access to Roman exemplars. The structure of the Montpellier manuscript is particularly interesting. The Variae are divided into 2 codicilogically distinct blocks. One contains books 1 to 4, while another begins again with its own numbering and corresponds essentially to books 8 to 13. Books 6 and 7 are absent. This division may be relevant because the Lazio notaries around 1000 drew their Cassiodorian material from books 4, 8, 9, and 11, but apparently not from 6 or 7. Later, Roman evidence shows a similar pattern. Reuses documented from the 12th through 14th centuries again draw predominantly from books 1 to 4 and 8 to 11. Only much later, in the 15th century, does clear evidence appear for Roman knowledge of book 7. Although this pattern cannot yet prove the existence of a particular Roman manuscript divided into 2 blocks, it raises the possibility that medieval access to the Variae was sometimes selective rather than complete. The question is complicated further by the extremely limited manuscript evidence predating the 12th century. Only 2 early fragments are normally discussed, the Fragmentum Copmanianum and the Folium Hallense. Older scholarship often connected these fragments with a supposed complete manuscript of the Variae at Lorsch, but that interpretation has recently been challenged. If the Lorsch hypothesis is incorrect, the geographical origin of the 2 fragments becomes open again. Textual evidence has led some scholars to suggest an Italian origin, possibly even Rome. Their scripts do not correspond neatly with the distinctive Minuscola Romanesca commonly associated with Rome and Lazio in the 10th and 11th centuries. But this does not exclude a Roman origin because not every manuscript produced in the region used that script. The relationship between these fragments, later complete manuscripts, and the documentary borrowings of Lazio therefore remains unresolved. Nevertheless, The evidence makes it increasingly difficult to assume that Cassiodorus's Variae disappeared from circulation before suddenly re-emerging in the High Middle Ages. Documentary. Practice around 1000 suggests that at least portions of the collection were already available to trained notaries. More importantly, the Lazio evidence reveals the character of that reception. The Variae were not preserved merely because readers were interested in Ostrogothic history. Their language was useful. Notaries could extract authoritative and elegant formulas from Cassiodorus, reshape them, combine them with scripture, and insert them into legal documents dealing with the realities of 11th century society. This reuse also reflects continuity between late antique and medieval documentary culture. Terms, offices, legal forms, and rhetorical traditions inherited from Roman administration remained meaningful even though the institutions themselves had changed dramatically. Cassiodorian language could therefore bridge two very different worlds: the bureaucratic government of Ostrogothic Italy and the ecclesiastically dominated property networks of medieval Lazio. At the same time, the meaning of the borrowed formulas changed substantially. A 6th century appeal to civic responsibility became a justification for supporting monasteries. Praise for the distribution of public offices became an argument for testamentary generosity. Royal mercy in suspending legal obligations became a model for representing medieval judicial resolution. Reuse therefore involved interpretation as much as preservation. The concentration of these borrowings among a small group of professional notaries is particularly significant. It suggests that the transmission of the Variae may have depended not only on monasteries and libraries, but also on specialized documentary environments. Formula collections, personal notebooks, exemplars, and professional networks could all have helped preserve Cassiodorian language, even when complete manuscripts were rare. The evidence from 997 to 1027 consequently pushes the documented medieval reception of the Variae much earlier than the manuscript boom traditionally associated with the 12th century. It suggests that the later widespread success of Cassiodorus did not emerge suddenly. Instead, a quieter tradition of selective reuse was already operating in central Italy around the first millennium. Taken together, these documents reveal a creative medieval engagement with Cassiodorus. The notaries of Rome and Lazio were not simply copying prestigious antique phrases for decoration. They recognized that Cassiodorus offered a language capable of giving legal acts moral seriousness, historical authority, and rhetorical sophistication. By combining his formulas with biblical and patristic material, they created new texts adapted to the religious and institutional realities of their own age. The broader significance of this evidence lies in what it tells us about textual survival. A work does not need to survive in numerous complete manuscripts to remain culturally active. It can persist through excerpts, formulas, professional memory, partial codices, and adapted microtexts. The history of the Variae around the year 1000 therefore demonstrates that literary transmission can continue beneath the level normally visible in manuscript catalogues. Ultimately, the early reuse of Cassiodorus in Lazio helps bridge the poorly documented period between the Carolingian world and the later medieval revival of the Variae. It shows that Cassiodorus's political and administrative language was already being rediscovered and transformed by notaries working in Rome and its surrounding territories. What would later become a widespread European chancery tradition may thus have deeper roots in the legal and documentary culture of central Italy around the turn of the first millennium. The discussion now moves from identifying Cassiodorian borrowings to examining the social, cultural, and political environments in which they were produced. Rather than treating every notary separately, the evidence is divided into two groups: Stephanus, the Tabellio of Tivoli, and the Roman Scriniari. This distinction is useful because the Roman notaries frequently worked within the same institutional environment and interacted closely with one another, while many surviving documents are later copies that make precise individual identification difficult. Stephanus of Tivoli represents an older notarial tradition with roots in late antiquity. He is known from documents dating between 963 and 1007, an unusually long career that makes him an experienced legal practitioner by the turn of the millennium. Throughout these documents, he identifies himself as Tabellio Civitatis Tibotinae. The title Tabellio belonged to a Roman tradition of professional document writers that survived for centuries after the collapse of the Western Empire in several cities of Lazio. Stephanus's documentary practice reveals his strong attachment to Roman legal culture. He produced leases, settlements, judicial agreements, and donations using formulas that still show important similarities with 6th and 7th century documents from Italy. His legal vocabulary and documentary structures were therefore deeply rooted in late antique traditions, particularly those associated with Justinianic law. Yet Stephanus was working in a society that had changed considerably. The legal forms available to him did not always correspond neatly with the political and economic relationships he was attempting to describe. In one case, for example, he employed the ancient Roman structure of locatio conductio for an agreement that more closely resembled medieval rural lordship. A powerful aristocrat granted land to a socially inferior family in return for clearly defined payments in agricultural products and other dues. The terminology used in that agreement reveals the coexistence of old and new systems. Although the legal framework remained Roman, the payments were described, not by the classical term pensio, but by the medieval fiscal term datio. Stephanus was therefore attempting to express emerging medieval social relationships through inherited Roman documentary structures. A similar mixture appears in his treatment of judicial settlements. After a placitum presided over by the bishop and the Duke Count of Tivoli, Stephanus did not produce the kind of judicial record becoming increasingly common elsewhere. Instead, he used the older, late antique form of a plenaria securitas, an amicable settlement. Nevertheless, he incorporated terminology such as deliberatio, definio, and delibero, words more characteristic of contemporary placitum documentation. His practice therefore combined inherited formulas with selective adaptation to newer legal customs. The most striking example comes from the year 1000, when the political community of Tivoli reorganized its relationship with the local bishop after the removal of one of the duke counts who had governed the city. The citizens agreed to make an annual payment to the episcopal see, effectively establishing a new political, symbolic, and fiscal relationship between the urban community and the bishop. Despite the political importance of this arrangement, Stephanus framed it as a chartula donationis, a simple charter of donation. The citizens were represented as donating an annual income to the bishop and to St. Lawrence, patron of the city. This suggests that Stephanus's inherited documentary categories were sometimes inadequate for the new political realities he encountered, forcing him to fit complex relationships into familiar legal forms. Stephanus nevertheless evolved during his long career. By 997, he had begun to describe himself not only as Tabellio, but also as dativus iudex. This title was associated with judicial responsibilities, especially participation in placitum assemblies, and became increasingly common among legal professionals in Lazio during the Ottonian period. His acquisition of judicial responsibilities may have encouraged him to expand his documentary culture. Significantly, the first surviving document in which Stephanus calls himself dativus iudex is also the earliest document in which he reuses material from Cassiodorus's Variae. The coincidence suggests that greater involvement in judicial affairs may have stimulated his search for new rhetorical and legal resources beyond the traditional formulas inherited by local tabelliones. The Roman scriniarii belong to a different institutional tradition. Their origins can be traced to the notaries and stenographers who served bishops in late antiquity, producing letters, administrative records, and acts of councils. As the papacy gradually assumed more political and administrative responsibilities in Lazio between the 7th and 8th centuries, these officials became increasingly integrated into the papal bureaucracy. They eventually acquired titles such as notarii regionarii and scriniarii sanctae Romanae ecclesiae. Until the 9th century, they were principally officials of the papal chancery, but during the 9th and 10th centuries, they increasingly began producing private documents alongside the older Roman tabelliones. By the 11th century, the scriniari were gradually replacing the traditional tabelliones as the dominant notarial group in Rome. The three Roman notaries associated with the Cassiodorian borrowings, Ioannis, Leo, and Petrus, fit directly into this institutional development. Their surviving work includes donations, refutations, sales, exchanges, judicial proceedings, and papal privileges. Their documentary range is therefore broader than that visible in Stephanus's surviving dossier. Leo, for example, produced the judicial record of 1012 that reused Variae 9:4. He worked in connection with the urban prefect and the powerful Roman leader Ioannis de Crescentio. Petrus produced not only private charters, but also a highly rhetorical papal privilege in 1017, where he explicitly identified himself as a notarius regionarius et scriniarius sanctae Romanae ecclesiae. Although the Roman scriniari continued to employ late antique documentary formulas inherited from the tabelliones, their culture was much more flexible. Their close relationship with the papacy, the papal chancery, its archives, and the judicial system gave them access to a much broader body of books, records, legal traditions, and rhetorical models. This institutional position helps explain the sophistication of their writing. They adapted Cassiodorian passages according to the specific function of each document. Material from Variae 11, 2, and 8, 29 was particularly suitable for ordinary donations, 4 for testamentary donations, and 9 for judicial proceedings. The selection of different passages for different documentary contexts demonstrates conscious adaptation rather than indiscriminate copying. Cassiodorus was only one component of their intellectual culture. The Roman notaries also drew extensively upon scripture and the Church Fathers. Their documents sometimes contain broader reflections on the importance of written records themselves, contrasting the durability of the written document with the weakness and unreliability of human memory. Petrus provides an especially revealing example. In a charter from 1012, he emphasizes the value of documentary evidence and also shows knowledge of Isidore of Seville's Etymologiae. From Isidore, he borrowed definitions concerning legal concepts such as pactum and placitum. His other documents refer to ancient senators, magistrates, and distinguished predecessors in order to justify principles derived ultimately from Roman and Justinianic law. The Roman scriniari therefore operated within a learned documentary culture in which Roman law, Christian scripture, patristic authority, Cassiodorus, Isidore, and inherited notarial formulas could all be combined. Their texts were simultaneously practical legal instruments and products of considerable intellectual sophistication. This adaptability ultimately gave the scriniari an advantage over the older tabelliones. While the latter tended to preserve formulas transmitted through generations, the scriniari belonged to an institutional environment that encouraged continuous adaptation. Their connection with the papal scrinium gave them access to changing legal practices, written models, and administrative needs. Between the late 10th and 12th centuries, the scriniarius consequently became an increasingly successful model of professional notary throughout Lazio. The prestige of the papal chancery may also have made Rome an important center for legal and documentary training, spreading the techniques and institutional culture of the scriniari into surrounding cities. The older tabelliones, however, did not simply disappear without adaptation. Stephanus's career suggests one possible path of survival: involvement in judicial institutions. By becoming judices dativi, experienced local notaries could acquire new authority and participate more directly in the developing judicial culture associated with placitum assemblies. Other examples from Rome, Sutri, Orte, Gallese, and Nepi show that several tabelliones entered the ranks of the judices dativi during the 11th century. Their practical experience in resolving disputes may have allowed them to remain relevant even as the documentary culture represented by the papal scriniari became dominant. The contrast between Stephanus and the Roman scriniari therefore illustrates a broader transformation in legal culture around the year 1000. Stephanus represents continuity with a deeply rooted late Roman notarial tradition. His documents preserve ancient legal categories even when they struggle to describe new political and economic relationships. The Roman scriniari, by contrast, combined inherited forms with a much more dynamic ability to incorporate new sources, institutional practices, and intellectual authorities. Cassiodorus's variae entered both environments, but probably through somewhat different processes. For Stephanus, their appearance may represent an attempt by an experienced but traditionally trained notary to expand his legal and rhetorical resources as his judicial responsibilities increased. For the Roman scriniari, Cassiodorus belonged naturally to a larger archive of authoritative texts accessible through papal documentary culture. The reuse of the variae must therefore be understood not merely as a literary phenomenon, but as part of changes in professional identity. These notaries were not scholars copying Cassiodorus for historical curiosity. They were legal specialists searching for language that could strengthen documents, justify transactions, articulate judicial principles, and connect contemporary practices with prestigious traditions of Roman authority. Their engagement with Cassiodorus also demonstrates that the boundary between literary and documentary culture was highly permeable. A 6th century political letter could become the rhetorical foundation of an 11th century donation. A royal argument about law and mercy could be transferred into a medieval court record. Ideas originally associated with Ostrogothic administration could be reshaped within papal, episcopal, monastic, and urban institutions. The Roman scriniari were especially effective at this process because their institutional position placed them at the intersection of law, ecclesiastical administration, archives, politics, and learned culture. Their eventual triumph over the older tabelliones was therefore not simply a matter of professional competition. It reflected the increasing importance of a documentary culture capable of adapting inherited Roman forms to the changing requirements of medieval government and society. Taken together, the careers of Stephanus and the Roman scriniari reveal a period of transition rather than a simple break between ancient and medieval documentary traditions. Old titles, formulas, and legal concepts survived, but they were continually reinterpreted. Some practitioners remained deeply attached to inherited models, while others developed more flexible combinations of Roman legal language, Christian authority, and contemporary institutional practice. The Cassiodorian borrowings around the year 1000 belong precisely to this environment of continuity and transformation. They show that the variae were useful because they offered notaries a prestigious language of authority, justice, public responsibility, generosity, and institutional order. Their revival was therefore connected not only with the survival of manuscripts, but with the practical needs of professionals attempting to give written form to a rapidly changing political and social world. The discussion now reaches its broadest question. Why did notaries in Lazio begin reusing Cassiodorus's variae around the year 1000? The answer cannot be established with complete certainty because the surviving documentary record is uneven. In several cities of Lazio, especially those shaped by Byzantine traditions, substantial archives survive only from the 10th century onward. Earlier, Cassiodorian borrowings may therefore have existed without leaving detectable traces. Nevertheless, the surviving evidence suggests that the renewed use of the variae was genuinely concentrated around the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Documents from the 9th and early 10th centuries already contain elaborate rhetorical introductions, but their principal sources are biblical and patristic. Only during the later Ottonian period do new kinds of learned references begin to appear more clearly within notarial and judicial writing. One major development was the appearance of officials called judices dativi. They first become visible in Rome during the 960s and subsequently appear in places such as Sutri, Tivoli, Cerveteri, and Farfa. They did not form a homogeneous professional or social class. Some belonged to the highest Roman aristocracy, while others were local notaries, legal specialists, advocates, or officials of more modest backgrounds. The title Iudex Dativus therefore seems to have described a judicial function rather than a fixed profession. These individuals were granted particular responsibilities within legal proceedings and often assisted more established judicial authorities, including the papal palatine judges. Because one of the earliest figures holding this title also used the designation Iudex Sacri Palatii, an office of imperial origin, the institution may have developed as part of judicial reforms encouraged by the presence of the Ottonian emperors in Rome and central Italy. The Iudices Dativi often possessed practical legal expertise. Documents from Fafa show some of them serving as advocates in disputes, using legal compilations to defend parties, or preparing legal opinions that helped guide judicial decisions. Their emergence therefore reflects a broader strengthening of technical legal knowledge in the region. At approximately the same time, documentary sources begin to reveal a much stronger engagement with learned legal texts. From the 960s onward, explicit use of Justinianic legal compilations such as the Summa Perusina and the Epitome Iuliani becomes increasingly visible. Lombard and Carolingian legal traditions were also actively consulted, especially in judicial disputes where advocates physically brought legal books into proceedings. The Placitum, the judicial assembly inherited from Carolingian practice, became an especially important environment for this intellectual activity. Judges, notaries, advocates, and officials with different legal traditions met there and confronted practical problems requiring authoritative solutions. These encounters encouraged professionals to search archives, consult unfamiliar texts, compare legal traditions, and improve the language and structure of their documents. Rome was exceptionally well suited to such activity because its papal and ecclesiastical archives preserved an enormous range of intellectual resources. One of the earliest known complete European manuscripts of Justinian's Institutiones, for example, appears to have been produced in Rome during the early 11th century. Its script, annotations concerning papal judges, and inclusion of an imperial capitulary issued at Pavia reveal an intellectual environment in which Roman, papal, and imperial traditions intersected. Such manuscripts may have functioned as practical instruments used by judges and notaries during judicial assemblies. The presence of notarial and judicial handwriting in historical manuscripts further demonstrates that these legal professionals were comfortable working within the broader learned culture surrounding the Lateran. The intellectual world of these officials extended far beyond practical law. A revealing example is Leo de Maximo, a Iudex Dativis who died in 1012. His elaborate funerary inscription connected his family with the Trojan tradition and the legendary Sergestus, companion of Aeneas. The fact that his posthumous legal affairs were handled by Petrus, one of the Roman scriniarii who reused Cassiodorus, illustrates how closely legal practice, classical culture, family memory, and literary learning could overlap. Lazio around the year 1000 should therefore be understood as a highly dynamic intellectual environment. Legal practitioners were actively searching for texts, following quotations, comparing traditions, and experimenting with inherited forms. This activity may represent an early stage of the developments that eventually produced the more famous revival of Roman law in the late 11th and 12th centuries. The later legal renaissance associated with Bologna did not emerge suddenly. Its deeper origins can be sought in the judicial cultures of cities such as Rome, Ravenna, and Pavia during the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The recovery of Justinianic law was only one part of a broader movement characterized by curiosity about ancient texts, institutional memory, documentary experimentation, and the recovery of forgotten intellectual resources. Similar tendencies appeared outside strictly legal scholarship. At Ravenna, old sheets of papyrus preserved in episcopal archives were reused to create a register of ecclesiastical concessions. At Pavia, documents attempted to reconstruct the traditional rites of the royal palace. In Catalonia, comital and episcopal scribes borrowed unusual vocabulary from late antique Greek-Latin glossaries to elevate the style of their documents. These examples suggest a widespread search for authoritative fragments of the past. The rediscovery of Cassiodorus's Variae in Lazio fits naturally within this broader environment. Judges and scriniarii, already immersed in Latin textual culture and actively involved in judicial proceedings, probably encountered one or more manuscripts of the collection while searching Roman archives. Stephanus of Tivoli may also have gained access to such material through the same professional networks. The presence of the variae did not necessarily revolutionize legal practice. Most surviving borrowings occur in arengae, rhetorical introductions to documents dealing with practical matters such as land, donations, lawsuits, and religious institutions. Yet the choice of an authority for an arenga was culturally meaningful because it indicated the intellectual tradition within which a notary wished to place his work. By introducing Cassiodorian language into their documents, the notaries of Lazio effectively incorporated Cassiodorus into their repertoire of respected authorities. His collection must have seemed particularly relevant because it contained references to Roman prefects, senators, judges, administrative appointments, popes, and questions of justice, all subjects that still had echoes within the political and institutional culture of Rome around 1000. The notaries may not initially have understood every historical context of the variae. The political world of Ostrogothic Italy was already distant and complicated, yet the location of the manuscripts within papal or administrative archives may have immediately suggested their practical function. They could be understood as a collection of prestigious chancery letters and therefore as a reservoir of high-level formulas suitable for reuse. In this sense, the variae became part of a larger search for documentary models. They did not ultimately become the principal engine of legal transformation. That role would belong increasingly to the corpus of Justinianic law. Yet their rediscovery demonstrates that the same intellectual curiosity responsible for recovering legal texts could also revive late antique, administrative, and rhetorical traditions. The impact of this rediscovery extended beyond the immediate period around 1000. During the later 11th and early 12th centuries, Rome underwent profound political and institutional changes. Older Carolingian structures declined, and the traditional placitum disappeared. Yet the judges and scriniari themselves survived. Freed from older administrative hierarchies, these professionals gradually transformed into urban specialists and participated in the formation of new communal institutions. Their accumulated documentary and literary culture passed into the emerging Roman commune. By the second half of the 12th century, the chancery of the Roman Senate once again used Cassiodorus's variae as a rhetorical model. Roman practices may also have influenced other Italian communal chanceries. Possible Cassiodorian borrowings appear in Genoa during the 12th century, suggesting that traditions initially recovered within Roman documentary culture could spread into broader networks of communal government. The rediscovery of the variae around 1000 was therefore not an isolated antiquarian curiosity. It belonged to a much larger transformation in which legal professionals searched the ancient and early medieval past for intellectual tools appropriate to contemporary problems. Some of those tools came from Justinianic law, others from Lombard legislation, scripture, patristic writings, classical history, or Cassiodorian administrative rhetoric. The survival of Cassiodorus within this environment demonstrates how old texts could acquire entirely new functions. Letters originally composed for the Ostrogothic court became models for medieval donations, lawsuits, and eventually communal correspondence. Their meaning changed, but their authority and rhetorical value remained useful. The broader conclusion is that the intellectual revival of the 11th and 12th centuries should be understood as the product of earlier processes already visible around the year 1000. Judicial practice stimulated textual research, archives became active sources of knowledge, and professional notaries served as important mediators between inherited written traditions and new medieval institutions. The text then turns to a different but related area of early medieval cultural history: inscriptions and the question of ethnic identity in post-Roman Italy. The new investigation focuses on artifacts from the late 6th and 7th centuries that have traditionally been assigned to Ostrogothic or Lombard contexts, before considering wider changes in writing and epigraphy during the 8th and 9th centuries. Some of the earliest examples come from the Euphrasian Basilica at Poreč in modern Croatia. Graffiti carved into the decoration of the apse record names such as Amara, Berga, and Richelda, while a damaged funerary inscription may preserve the name Gunnar. Several of these names have Germanic characteristics and have therefore been associated with populations connected with the Ostrogothic world. Such evidence is historically plausible because Ostrogothic political influence extended beyond the Italian peninsula into parts of the eastern Adriatic. Yet personal names alone cannot always establish ethnic identity with certainty, especially because Germanic names could survive and circulate across different political periods and cultural communities. Further examples come from the sanctuary of St. Michael on Monte Gargano in southern Italy. Among the numerous graffiti found there is the name Aligernus, unmistakably Germanic in origin. The name is particularly interesting because it appears in several different contexts across the 6th and later centuries. One Aligernus was the brother of the final Ostrogothic king Thea and surrendered to the Byzantine commander Narses in 554. Another appears in the correspondence of Gregory the Great in 598 as an Ostrogoth living in Campania and the father of a son bearing the Latin name Sabinus. A female form of the same name also appears in a 6th century inscription from northern Italy. The continued appearance of the name into the Lombard period demonstrates the difficulty of using names as simple ethnic markers. A name originally associated with an East Germanic tradition could survive long after the political disappearance of the Ostrogothic kingdom. The later abbot Aligernus of Monte Cassino, who died in 986, illustrates the extraordinary longevity of such naming traditions. Another intriguing artifact comes from Oria in Apulia. A silver fibula from a burial context carries a short Christian inscription beginning with a cross and apparently containing the name Amaliginus or something similar, followed by an abbreviation referring to the formula vivas in Deo. The object dates approximately to the late 6th or 7th century. The element Amal in the name has raised the possibility of a connection with the Amali, the famous royal dynasty of the Ostrogoths. Such an interpretation is attractive, but cannot be considered certain because the inscription is difficult to read and the object is poorly preserved. Nevertheless, it demonstrates how artifacts, personal names, Christian formulas, and burial contexts can intersect in attempts to reconstruct identities after the end of Ostrogothic political rule. Another uncertain example comes from the catacombs of St. John at Syracuse. A small funerary slab records a person named Guido. The name may derive from a Germanic linguistic root associated with compensation and appears compatible with both Ostrogothic and Lombard naming traditions. An alternative interpretation, however, connects Guido with the African name Gildo, famous from the late Roman military commander who rebelled against the Western Empire in the 4th century. This uncertainty again shows how difficult it is to derive ethnic identity purely from personal names, when linguistic traditions could overlap and change over time. The chronological context of the Syracuse inscription is also uncertain because many of the funerary inscriptions from the catacomb are difficult to date precisely. The cemetery was used across a long period, and the available evidence provides only broad chronological limits. The discussion finally moves toward northern Italy, where the corpus of potentially Germanic inscriptions is considerably larger. One important example is the inscription of Manfred from the Church of San Vincenzo at Galliano near Cantu, probably dating from the late 6th or early 7th century. Taken together, these inscriptions introduce a broader methodological problem that will shape the following discussion. Names and scripts traditionally described as Ostrogothic or Lombard do not necessarily correspond neatly with fixed ethnic communities. Personal names could survive across generations, migrate between regions, and coexist with Latin Christian culture. The transition from Ostrogothic to Lombard and post-Roman Italy must therefore be studied through a combination of epigraphy, archaeology, language, script, burial context, and documentary evidence rather than through personal names alone. What appears at first to be straightforward evidence of ethnic identity often reveals instead a much more complicated world of cultural continuity, adaptation, and interaction. The discussion turns to funerary inscriptions from northern Italy and neighboring regions that have often been classified as Ostrogothic or Lombard. These monuments show how difficult it is to assign ethnic identity on the basis of names, scripts, or decorative forms alone. Many examples stand precisely on the boundary between late antique, Gothic, and Lombard traditions, revealing continuity rather than a clean cultural break. The inscription of Manfred is a particularly important case. It was carved on a vertical marble slab divided symmetrically by a large Latin cross, while the lower part contains an Agnus Dei and a stylized tree. Its layout and decoration recall later Lombard funerary monuments, while its lettering preserves features comparable to epitaphs associated with individuals bearing clearly Gothic names. The name Manfred itself appears to contain Germanic elements referring to power and peace. This has encouraged the suggestion that the deceased may have been of Gothic background, even though the inscription belongs to a period normally associated with Lombard rule. Since the man died at the age of 52, he may have been born before the Lombard invasion of Italy in 568. His name could therefore preserve an older Gothic heritage, even though its spelling had already acquired Lombard characteristics. Most scholars nevertheless classify the monument as Lombard, leaving its precise cultural identity unresolved. Similar ambiguity appears in the inscription of Wideram from Castelseprio. The monument covered a prestigious grave associated with gilded copper spurs, suggesting that the deceased held relatively high social status. Traditionally dated to the first half of the 7th century, Wideram has often been regarded as a Lombard founder or elite figure connected with one of the important religious buildings at Castelseprio. His name is Germanic and can be connected with elements meaning wood and raven, but it occurs in both Ostrogothic and Lombard naming traditions. The name therefore cannot be established whether Wideram belonged to one population or the other. The decoration of the inscription adds another layer of complexity. A triple Christogram occupies the upper section and has sometimes been interpreted as a deliberate affirmation of Trinitarian doctrine, perhaps following Wideram's conversion from Arian Christianity to Catholicism. Yet this still does not resolve his ethnic identity because both Ostrogoths and Lombards practiced Arian Christianity during different periods. Late antique traditions did not disappear with the collapse of Roman political authority in the West. Instead, they continued to survive and evolve throughout Ostrogothic, Lombard, and Carolingian Italy. Inscriptions, legal traditions, manuscripts, administrative practices, and architecture reveal a long process in which inherited Roman forms were continually adapted to changing political, religious, and social circumstances. Funerary inscriptions provide particularly clear evidence of this continuity. Germanic personal names frequently appeared within monuments that remained firmly rooted in Roman and Christian traditions. Individuals such as Berovulfus, Sendefara, Manfred, and Wideram cannot easily be classified according to rigid Gothic or Lombard categories. Their names, religious symbols, inscriptions, and archaeological contexts reveal a world in which Roman, Christian, Gothic, and Lombard traditions overlapped for generations. Local stone workshops played an important role in maintaining these connections. The same workshops could produce monuments for individuals belonging to different cultural backgrounds, while older Roman stones were sometimes cut and transformed into new Christian tombstones. Roman material culture was therefore not simply preserved, but physically reshaped to serve new communities and new identities. During the later 7th and 8th centuries, Lombard epigraphy gradually developed more distinctive characteristics. Decoration became increasingly prominent. Letters were often arranged more vertically, and poetic inscriptions became important among kings, queens, nobles, and religious elites. Nevertheless, older late antique traditions continued alongside these innovations. Different styles could coexist, making many monuments difficult to classify according to a single period or ethnic identity. The Carolingian period introduced another major transformation. From the late 8th century onward, attempts were made to create clearer, more regular, and more standardized forms of writing. Carolingian minuscule became one of the most important products of this development and eventually spread throughout much of Western Europe. Its influence extended beyond manuscripts and became visible in monumental inscriptions as well. Monasteries were particularly important in connecting manuscript and epigraphic culture. The same religious communities commissioned books and inscriptions, allowing visual forms to move between parchment and stone. Monumental lettering could influence manuscripts just as manuscript styles could influence inscriptions. This interaction became increasingly important during the Carolingian period and remained fundamental throughout the Middle Ages. Regional differences nevertheless remained strong. The Carolingian attempt to standardize writing never completely eliminated local traditions. The appearance and quality of inscriptions continued to depend upon individual craftsmen, workshops, patrons, available materials, and economic resources. Early medieval writing therefore developed through a combination of broader cultural movements and strong regional traditions. A similar pattern can be observed in architecture. Roman palaces had originally combined residential, political, ceremonial, administrative, judicial, and religious functions. During late antiquity, imperial residences multiplied as emperors, increasingly governed from cities such as Milan, Trajan, Ravenna, Nicomedia, Thessaloniki, and Constantinople. Political authority consequently became associated with several different centers rather than exclusively with Rome. Other buildings also performed important administrative functions. Praetoria, villas, and aristocratic residences could contain reception halls, courts, baths, storage facilities, religious spaces, and administrative offices. As traditional Roman civic institutions declined, political and administrative activities increasingly moved into these alternative environments. Ostrogothic rulers inherited much of this architectural landscape. Theoderic and his successors reused or restored Roman buildings in cities such as Rome, Ravenna, Milan, Pavia, Verona, and Monza. These enormous complexes could no longer always be maintained in their original form, but important sections continued to serve political and ceremonial purposes. Ravenna became one of the clearest examples of this continuity. Theodoric adapted the earlier imperial palace and added new ceremonial and religious structures. His government therefore presented itself not as something entirely detached from the Roman past, but as a political authority capable of occupying and transforming Roman imperial spaces. The Lombard kings continued this strategy. Earlier, Roman and Gothic palaces were reused in Milan, Pavia, Verona, Ravenna, Monza, and elsewhere. Churches, workshops, ceremonial halls, administrative spaces, and residential areas were inserted into older complexes. Rather than constructing an entirely new political landscape, Lombard rulers frequently transformed the one they had inherited. Pavia became especially important as the political center of the Lombard kingdom. Its palace was more than a royal residence. It included religious spaces, workshops connected with luxury production, administrative functions, and probably educational activities associated with the court. Political authority therefore depended upon a wider institutional environment surrounding the ruler. Other centers followed similar patterns. Brescia, Cividale, Monza, Corteolona, and Salerno all demonstrate how Roman or Gothic buildings could acquire new functions under Lombard rule. Queen Theodelinda's residence at Monza combined inherited architectural traditions with a specifically Lombard royal identity, while Liutprand's complex at Corteolona used prestigious decoration and imported materials to evoke the monumental culture of Rome. The palace of Arichis II at Salerno offers an especially striking example. Built partly over an earlier Roman bath complex, it incorporated Roman marble, porphyry, architectural fragments, and other reused materials. Its chapel and ceremonial areas deliberately evoked the prestige of late antique architecture. Reusing Roman material therefore had symbolic significance in addition to reducing construction costs. This pattern extended beyond royal residences. Roman villas, fortified settlements, and administrative buildings could become centers of medieval government, agriculture, craft production, or estate management. Strategic sites such as Castel Seprio remained occupied through several political periods because their location and infrastructure continued to be useful. Faragola demonstrates how dramatically an inherited Roman site could be transformed. Former elite spaces were converted into kitchens, warehouses, workshops, and agricultural facilities. Metalworking, glassmaking, pottery production, animal husbandry, and cereal cultivation became increasingly important. The Roman villa survived not by preserving its original function, but by acquiring completely new ones. Economic conditions encouraged such transformations. Early medieval rulers no longer possessed the enormous taxation system that had financed the Roman imperial state. Political authority increasingly depended upon landed estates, tribute, agricultural production, and regional administrative networks. Reusing existing buildings was therefore far more practical than constructing enormous new monumental complexes. Political symbolism was equally important. Occupying an ancient palace connected a new ruler with earlier traditions of authority. Roman architecture provided a visual language of legitimacy that Gothic and Lombard rulers could appropriate. The physical survival of these buildings allowed new political systems to present themselves as successors to prestigious earlier regimes. The same process can be seen in documentary culture. Cassiodorus's Variae, Roman legal traditions, biblical writings, and older administrative formulas remained useful because medieval officials could adapt them to new situations. Around the year 1000, notaries and judges in Lazio returned to Cassiodorian language while searching archives for authoritative models suitable for contemporary documentary and judicial practices. Such reuse was part of a broader revival of interest in legal and administrative knowledge. Judges, notaries, and officials consulted Justinianic law, Lombard and Carolingian legislation, religious writings, historical works, and older documentary traditions. Archives became active intellectual environments where fragments of the ancient world could be recovered and transformed for contemporary purposes. Continuity, therefore, did not require the unchanged preservation of ancient institutions. A Roman legal expression could acquire a new medieval meaning. A 6th century letter could become a model for a later document. A Roman funerary monument could be transformed into a Christian tombstone. An imperial palace could become the residence of a Gothic or Lombard ruler. Older forms survived because later societies continually discovered new purposes for them. The transition from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages was consequently neither a simple collapse nor a complete replacement of Roman civilization. Roman, Christian, Ostrogothic, Lombard, and Carolingian traditions interacted over several centuries. Political changes could be dramatic, but cultural and material transformations usually occurred more gradually. Rigid ethnic categories are particularly inadequate for understanding this world. A person with a Germanic name could be commemorated through Roman Christian formulas, while a monument produced under Lombard rule could preserve late antique artistic traditions. Cultural identity emerged from overlapping practices rather than from clearly separated Roman, Gothic, or Lombard worlds. Writing and architecture ultimately reveal the same historical pattern. Ancient forms remained influential because they could be adapted. Inscriptions preserved classical traditions while incorporating new languages of identity. Palaces retained Roman spaces while gaining churches, workshops, and medieval administrative functions. Legal and documentary culture similarly transformed ancient vocabulary into tools suitable for new institutions. The early medieval world was therefore constructed through a continuous dialogue between inheritance and innovation. Antiquity survived in fragments of language, law, architecture, inscriptions, religious imagery, administrative titles, and political ceremony. Successive generations selected these fragments, reorganized them, and gave them meanings appropriate to their own societies. What emerged was not simply the survival of Rome, but its continual reinterpretation. Ostrogothic Italy, the Lombard kingdoms, the Carolingian world, and the societies around the year 1000 remained connected through traditions that were repeatedly transformed rather than abandoned. Ancient forms remained alive precisely because they were flexible enough to change, making continuity through adaptation one of the defining characteristics of the transition from the Roman Mediterranean to medieval Europe.